Well, this is the day the brothers part ways. This beautiful day was ruined by a conspicuous bout of wailing. Calix couldn't understand why Leo was crying so sadly. It was just a few years of separation, right? The sensitive Oscar also shed tears, begging the boy to be sure to write to them often. The Prince of the Rosebell Empire held Leo, trying his best to comfort him. Romeo hated these kinds of somber moments. Rio just stared at his friends, unable to stop his tears from flowing. The problem was, Rio knew the future, and he knew he might never see this group of friends again. When he was 8 years old, the crown prince nearly drowned, and it was then that the memories of his past life came flooding back. In her past life, the protagonist was terminally ill and spent most of her time in the hospital reading romance novels. She also played a ton of games and sincerely wished to be reincarnated as a video game character after she died. As it turned out, someone heard her wish, and yes, she was reincarnated, but not as the protagonist. And guess what? She was trapped in a novel. She became Relia, a side character whose mother died early, a damn princess in the book. The church selected boys of royal blood to prepare for the dragon's arrival. But it wasn't Rio who went to the temple, but an imposter. The real Rio's fate was tragic. He died as soon as the heroine's stepfather ascended the throne. Years later, Relia returned from the temple and died almost immediately just by tripping and falling into a pond. Seriously, there was no way she was going to die just like that. After all, she had just been given a new life. She tried to keep her distance from everyone in the novel, hiding her true identity, but ended up becoming friends with all the heirs anyway. Then one day, they went their separate ways. She returned to the country where her character was born, by which time her friends had already defeated the dragon. Their victory was certainly amazing, but she had her own crap to deal with and had no time to fangirl. One day, a man stopped her on the street, convinced that she was his companion. The question caught her off guard. She hadn't seen any of her friends in a long time. It turned out, rumors were spreading everywhere that the murderer of the crown prince was living the good life as a princess. It seemed all her friends believed it. They hated her and wanted revenge for the prince. They all wanted to know why Relia, or rather Rio, had killed the former crown prince. The protagonist's personal crap had no effect on the atmosphere of the entire city. Everywhere you went, you could hear the cheers of the townspeople celebrating their victory over the evil dragon. The story of the four heroes reuniting after 6 years was the talk of every tavern. But the heroes themselves were in no mood to party. One of them was currently sitting alone in his castle. The person who walked in caught the attention of the guy who was spacing out. The handsome blonde man thought that drinking alone was just too boring. The black-haired man knew that no amount of alcohol would make them forget what had happened. The master of the castle asked the blonde man how the tracking magic was progressing. Even after all these years, they still hoped to find some clues. All these years, they had been hunting for the person who killed someone important to them. The blonde man understood what his friend was thinking, but didn't know how else he could help him. The man's gaze locked onto a neatly packed suitcase with a stuffed rabbit sitting on top. He immediately recognized whose it was, and the realization stung his heart once again. Meanwhile, another hero had not given up hope of finding the killer. Calix was all packed and ready to go, convinced that this time would be different. Super Ion, as always, warned him to be careful and not to look for trouble. He pleaded with Calix to contact him no matter what, saying he wanted to help his friend. Finally, he thanked Calix again for giving him the chance to fight alongside him in the Conqueror Super Ion squad. He sincerely hoped to one day introduce the hero to his niece. The hero made it clear he wasn't interested in meeting her, so Cyprian took his leave a few seconds later. The hero walked alone through the streets. Even though he had saved the world, his soul was a mess because he couldn't save his friend. Back at the castle, Oscar wasn't celebrating either. He admitted to himself, once again, how much he missed Rio. He walked over to the armchair, a hint of annoyance on his face, and stared at the toy. Picking up the stuffed rabbit, he felt that familiar pang of loss once more. Looking at the rabbit, he swore to find the person who killed his friend. Soon, Oscar decided he would take revenge on the killer with his own hands. In fact, this story originally had a completely different ending. The book about the group of hero friends was called Conquerors of the Light Dragon. On a sunny day, the protagonist bought a copy of this book at a book fair. She couldn't wait to open it, but immediately realized there was a serious problem with the plot. The illustrations of the main characters were nothing like she had imagined. The story itself seemed like complete garbage to her. She knew exactly what kind of pain these heroes had gone through. All she wanted right now was a chance to see them again and nothing more. The sound of a blade being drawn brought her back to reality, followed by the question of whether she was the one who murdered his friend. All of her friends were convinced that she was responsible for Leo's death. The way they looked at her was forever burned into her memory. Her 4 friends had betrayed her all at once, filled with hatred. They just wanted to see her dead, and the sooner the better. Now, they had found her, ready to finally get their revenge for the murder. Terrified, she began to say that it was all a lie. She desperately tried to tell the truth, but something was stopping her. A voice in her head kept repeating that the person with whom she shared these memories was no longer there. The girl knew this was the end of her story. She closed her eyes in fear and heartbreak as her childhood friends were about to kill her. In the sacred neutral zone, Prince Rio fell into the lake and was discovered by one of his companions. The boy reacted quickly, averting a tragedy and pulling the crown prince out of the water. The blonde boy yelled at the servants to hurry, as Rio had swallowed a lot of water. The adults immediately summoned a magic circle, focusing it on the boy. A moment later, the boy started coughing, expelling the water from his lungs. A servant noted that, for some reason, Rio's body temperature still hadn't returned to normal. Opening his eyes, Rio heard them say they were going to move him to a tent. He immediately replied that he was fine, and that he didn't need any help. The boy just sat down on the ground and told everyone to leave him alone. Finally, in a warm bath, Rio tried hard to calm himself down, repeating that everything was fine, everything was okay. He was still in shock, and any sound or sudden movement around him made him jump. Rio prayed that he wouldn't die, since no one had seen what happened. She felt exhausted and, for some reason, still cold. Memories of the hospital flooded her mind, where only pain and loneliness surrounded her. She was so weak she could barely do anything, and even reading romance novels was starting to get old. Lately, she had been spending more and more time on her phone, playing all sorts of games. The black-haired girl was very keen on buying materials in the virtual shop and brewing medicines there. In one of the last games she played, she made some medicine to heal a village girl. Video games were the perfect escape, a world where our girl could do whatever she wanted. She happily hoarded all her loot in the game, living lavishly, even if only there. In those moments, she truly forgot about her awful reality. While playing, she forgot she was terminally ill and just counting down her days. She increasingly dreamed of being sucked into a game world after she died. And now, she was incredibly annoyed that her wish had come true in the worst possible way. Okay, the reincarnation part itself was pretty cool, but she didn't end up in a game. As it turned out, she was thrown into the story of some cheesy romance novel she had read. What scared her most was the face staring back at her in the mirror. A cold dread washed over her when she realized she was trapped in the body of Aurelia. The servants' voices, worried about the crown prince's condition, pulled the protagonist from her fearful thoughts. They didn't dare to come in, simply asking if Rio was all right. He tried his best to make his voice sound calm and replied that he was fine. After the servants left, the protagonist let out a heavy sigh of relief. The girl realized she had once again cheated death, surviving thanks to the priest's magic. The thought of death made her tremble in fear again. She was trapped in the body of a minor side character, so she knew almost nothing about Aurelia. For example, the protagonist had no idea what this mark on her hand meant. The girl felt completely helpless. She really didn't want to live another meaningless life. Currently, Ridios ruled the Aurarian Empire, and he had a sister named Iris, who, according to the story, had passed away 7 years ago. Before her death, Iris had been deeply in love with a common knight and had a child with him, a daughter. Due to the chaos in the empire and the fight for the throne, they had completely forgotten about Aurelia's existence. So basically, her entire childhood was spent in a small tower on the edge of the castle. Aurelia only had worn-out clothes and a few maids. It was thanks to them that she didn't starve to death. Those years were tough, but honestly, they were also the most peaceful days she had. Everything changed the day Emperor Ridios summoned her. Ridios bluntly stated that his sister had been foolish to have a child. But from the Emperor's demeanor, he was very excited that Aurelia was standing before him. He had learned from the maids that absolutely no one knew of her existence besides them. The Emperor liked this answer, and then, with a bang, he stood up, walked straight to Aurelia, and grabbed her hand. He said she had the mark of a blood oath on her hand, proving she was a member of the royal family. Ridios also noted that she was about the same age as Prince Rio. Then he coldly ordered his servants to kill all the maids. He went on to say that a long time ago, 5 knights defeated a dragon and saved the world. Later, each knight established their own empire. When the dragon reawakened, the knights who had made the blood oath had to answer the church's call. Many years passed, and now a dragon egg had appeared in the world again. The egg was indestructible and surrounded by dark magic. Because of it, monsters reawakened, and everyone was terrified. The church ordered that the emperor's descendants must train at the temple and slay the dragon. And so these 5 became humanity's new greatest hope. Afterward, the emperor called the children a bunch of idiots and drew his sword. Ridios felt that now that he had finally gotten rid of the thorn in his side, nothing could stop him from ascending the throne. He didn't want to send his only son to the temple, because his rivals, or even the temple staff, could finish him off there. After telling his story, the emperor asked the girl if she understood everything. By then, her hair had been cut short, and she still looked at Ridios with fear in her eyes. He concluded by saying that from now on, she would go to the temple in place of his son, Rio. Recalling all this, the girl started pounding the bed, furious at the despicable emperor. Remembering the delicious food calmed her dark thoughts a little. She understood that the novel's protagonist had no choice but to agree to Ridios' demands. If the emperor hadn't used her back then, she couldn't even guarantee she would have survived. She decided she needed to start thinking positively and focus on the plot she knew. If she didn't change anything, really his life would end with a plunge into the royal pond. This meant that as long as she was training at the temple, she would be perfectly safe. Asking for help was too risky, as no one knew Relia's secret. She began to panic about her situation. If Relia messed up, the Emperor's word magic would activate, and she would be turned to dust in an instant. This whole thing was a lot like her life in a hospital. It seemed not much had really changed. She was angry that even in this new life, she had to wait for death at someone else's command. After clearing her head, the girl decided not to let things play out according to the script she knew. She had become Relia at the age of 7, so she still had time to change everything. All she had to do was avoid all the novel's main characters and not die in a pond. But first, she needed to survive the next 3 years in the temple. No one could find out that she was a fake Rio. During that time, the girl was excited. She headed to where the future heroes were resting. Meanwhile, one of the crown princes was already watching her from the shadows. The Croit Temple didn't just train the chosen heirs to the throne. There were also many children of nobles from various countries. The protagonist figured these nobles were just there to secure future alliances with other great families. Compared to the hospital she was in before, this place was a paradise. The dining hall was the biggest attraction, always filled with all sorts of delicious food. Relia overheard some girls complaining that they couldn't get used to the routine or the food here. They grumbled about not being allowed to bring their own servants. The girls also complained that wearing the same uniform every day was boring. Relia found her clothes quite comfortable, especially compared to what her character used to wear. One small problem for our girl was that the novel had absolutely no information about life in this temple. It was only mentioned twice later on, and only in the form of rumors. There was nothing about how Relia spent her 3 years here. Since she was supposed to die in the royal pond, they assured her that nothing dangerous would happen at the temple. Her main task was to keep a low profile here and not draw attention to herself. Still, the girl was bothered by one question. How exactly does one trip and drown in a royal pond? At least they didn't throw her into some poor, remote village, which was a silver lining. Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice asking if she was okay. The kid who had appeared so suddenly and so close caught her completely off guard. The guy grinned and said he was the one who had saved Rio yesterday. The blonde boy looked her over, repeating that he had saved her from drowning yesterday. The guy suspected Rio didn't know about his heroic deed, but she quickly reassured him and thanked him for saving her life. After that, Relia took a good look at her new acquaintance. The blonde boy was definitely a looker and certainly one of the story's heroes, Romeo Roseberry. He was one of the heroes who would eventually defeat the evil dragon. The girl remembered that in the plot, this guy had a kind and righteous personality. The silence made Romeo a bit nervous. He told Rio to stop staring and say something. Rio finally snapped out of it and thanked Romeo again for saving him. It seemed a simple thank you wasn't enough for the handsome blonde. He wanted to know why the crown prince was saying thank you so many times as a sign of gratitude. Romeo thought the protagonist might not know any other words. This cheeky attitude didn't match the kind young man from the novel at all. An impatient Rio cut to the chase and asked what Romeo wanted from him. Romeo needed the protagonist to cover for him while he went to pray at the shrine. His plan was for Rio to say that Romeo had fallen asleep in his room and shouldn't be disturbed. Relia thought the request was childish. Romeo figured that if the crown prince told the monks this story, they would believe it without question. The protagonist didn't want to get involved, but she owed her savior a favor, so she agreed. The girl realized this guy was nothing like people said he was. The protagonist decided she was going to eat as well as she could during her time at the temple. She knew it would be hard to eat well once she returned home. Romeo was curious if Rio had a mark on his palm. When he answered yes, the kid wanted to see it to make sure it was real. Relia was curious to see what the handsome blonde would say about her mark. Seeing a mark identical to his own, Romeo was now fully convinced that all 5 heirs had won. Just then, all the girls in the room suddenly focused their attention on someone else. When the protagonist saw who everyone was staring at, she was shocked again. It was Griffith Nakia, who looked completely detached from everything happening around him. Romeo clearly didn't get along with Griffith, as he immediately called him stupid and pathetic. The girl genuinely couldn't understand how anyone could dislike Griffith. One day, this kid would become one of the most legendary heroes in the world. He would also be remembered as one of the youngest emperors in history. Among the heroes, he would be known as the strongest, but he had a super calm personality. The girl didn't know what beef Romeo had with the guy at the temple, but it certainly wasn't anything good. A moment later, she spotted another face that would one day become famous. His eerie red eyes and silver hair stood out in the crowd. After a moment, she recognized him as Oscar Hirschfeld. History would remember that guy as the Mad Emperor. Romeo saw another person who annoyed him. It was Calix Asgard, another big shot from the Empire who would later become a legend. The girl remembered Calix well. He was the nephew of the Asgard Emperor. After the Light Dragon hunt, he was the one who paid the ultimate price. The girl felt something was off as she was suddenly surrounded by all the main characters from the novel. Relia remembered that at the end of the story, Calix ended up marrying the main female character, his childhood sweetheart. Romeo's question brought her back to her senses. He wanted to confirm if Rio hated those guys as much as he did. She hesitated with her answer, which displeased Romeo. They were friends now, which meant she had to hate them too. The girl was stunned by this logic, but she tried to keep a straight face. She just said, "Yes, I feel the same way about those boys." Romeo felt the answer was half-hearted. She looked down at her soup, having to remember what was important. She just wanted to eat well and avoid all those future heroes as much as possible. If Relia wanted to survive in this novel's world, she absolutely had to stay away from them. From now on, she would avoid any contact with the Imperial heirs. After lunch, our girl decided to take a walk and get a good look at the temple. But she had to stop because she heard a child wailing. It was Oscar, who had burst into tears, acting as if he wanted to shut everyone out. He kept repeating no as tears streamed down his face. The kid tried to stop crying and calm down, but he just couldn't. He heard his father's voice in his head, feeling as if a giant, bloody sword was hanging over him. The voice was angry because Oscar had looked away from his dead mother. The voice demanded that the child gaze into his late mother's eyes. According to the voice, those bloodshot eyes were a symbol of bloodshed. Oscar could still hear the voice, and now it was calling him a monster. The voice kept repeating that the child was a real monster. The boy covered his ears, just to block out the voice. Then he heard his mom calling his name. At some point, the child's mom woke up and told her son she was in pain. The woman's hand tried to reach for the boy's face. The mom begged her child to save her. She said it over and over again. Out of the corner of his eye, Oscar saw a hand appear in front of him. Immediately after, he heard a completely different voice. The face that appeared told him that all the images in his head were just lies. Hands reached for Oscar's face, telling him not to listen to the voices in his head. Oscar finally made eye contact with the kid. Rio kept telling him to look straight at him. Then the protagonist told Oscar to calm down. She added that he was safe. Now Rio chimed in that the kid was out of danger and completely unharmed. The monks, arriving late, ran over to figure out what had happened. They surrounded the crown prince, asking him what had happened. The girl noticed that the guy looked much better now. She calmed down herself and took a deep breath. Honestly, the protagonist was very proud of herself for being able to pull Oscar out of that terrible hallucination. She felt sorry for the little guy, especially knowing what he had just witnessed. She just stood there, watching as the monks led the crown prince away. His own father had slaughtered countless people in front of the child, including his mother. The father called him a monster because of the color of Oscar's eyes, and the poor guy suffered his whole life because of it, until she told him his eyes were beautiful. It was only then that our protagonist understood that it made sense to exorcise his inner demons like that. It was all so simple in the novel, but seeing a little boy suffer like this with her own eyes felt terrible. The protagonist understood that Oscar's childhood was far more difficult than she had imagined. So when the child started having an episode, she immediately told the others to run and get a priest. She couldn't bear to watch the child suffer. It was only now that she realized she had inadvertently messed up the backstory of a major character. Romeo quietly approached her and said she looked a lot like a heretic, which startled her. The girl questioned him, asking why he just stood by and watched when he saw Oscar needed help. He clearly didn't like the question because he said that falling into a pond and this situation were two completely different things. She didn't accept that answer at all, but still decided not to say anything to the blonde kid. Without saying more, she just walked away, but Romeo seemed to follow her. He asked about the spell Ray used, but Ray retorted that she was just trying to calm him down. Romeo shot back. How do you calm down someone who's possessed by a demon? In the world of this novel, the perception of ordinary people was very limited. Anyone who suffered from something intangible was automatically labeled as possessed by a demon. This was precisely why no one tried to help Oscar. During his episodes, even the priests of the temple at one point began to suspect Oscar was possessed. Perhaps this was what later severely affected Oscar's mental health. The girl told Romeo matter-of-factly that demons weren't real, and that it was just the after effects of some bad experiences from his past. She compared Oscar's episode to the fear one feels during a nightmare. Romeo wasn't buying it, saying her logic was complete nonsense. He started ranting that Ray, as the crown prince of Aurelia, shouldn't be acting like that. At that moment, she thought Romeo was a total weirdo. She recalled that the grown-up Romeo was always super gentle and considerate to the protagonist. For a moment, the girl remembered that Romeo had his own past baggage. Romeo wanted to hear more about this story, so Aurelia had no choice but to ask him which part he was referring to. He wanted to know more about people who have nightmares, even when they're awake. It seemed Romeo was very fixated on this topic. He was practically begging her to tell him everything she knew. The girl just took his eagerness as normal curiosity. After all, she was just dealing with a nosy, ordinary kid. Aurelia tried to explain that the human mind is very fragile and unstable, and if a traumatic event occurs, your brain will replay it over and over again. Eventually, it stops being a memory and starts to feel like reality. When Ray mentioned that some people commit suicide because of it, Romeo flew into a rage, saying it was a great sin. He believed that people who commit suicide offer their souls to the devil, which goes against the teachings and is a sin. The girl simply replied that some people can't help it. Romeo thought the reason these people had problems was because they were possessed by demons. Aurelia tried to make the blonde kid understand that constant hallucinations mess with your mind, and that's what leads to death. The protagonist finally understood why Romeo was so sensitive about her words. He had actually witnessed his own mother's suicide. She was forced into a political marriage for power, and no one cared about her feelings. Her only bit of luck was that the emperor genuinely tried to fall in love with Romeo's mother. He didn't force her and just waited for her to open her heart to him. Then, her parents started threatening her, saying they would kill her true love if she didn't produce an heir. That's how Romeo was born. But her parents kept exploiting her weakness, using her lover as leverage every time they wanted something. But one day, the man who was locked in the dungeon killed himself. He did it so the Empress could finally be free and no longer suffer. She blamed herself for his death, fell into despair, and began to have hallucinations. In the end, she chose the same path as the man she loved. She had no idea that her son would witness her end. Rumors immediately spread through the castle that the Empress had died because she was possessed by a demon. The servants worried that Romeo might suffer the same fate. This completely broke the boy who had grown up with love. Although the blonde teenager didn't suffer from hallucinations like Oscar, that wound never truly healed. In the book, Romeo had only ever confessed his fear of demons to the protagonist. The girl couldn't pretend she didn't know about the young man's problem. She knew that one day this wound would heal. She looked at her companion and decided to put his mind at ease. Aurelia reiterated that demons weren't real at all and finished by saying she completely believed it. She pointed out that it's not imaginary demons that cause suffering, but living people. These words seemed to sting him too, and for a moment he didn't know what to say. He collected his thoughts and finally decided to continue the topic. Romeo was now fully convinced that Ray was a heretic, which was something she hadn't expected at all. Romeo was still upset, but decided to explain his reasoning. He thought only a heretic would believe such things. Romeo said that if the priests heard her, they would burn her at the stake for heresy. Ray asked Romeo with a threatening look if he had considered the consequences of his big mouth. The protagonist suddenly grabbed the guy's shirt, startling him. She warned him that no one could know about their little talk, and if Romeo let it slip, Ray would kill him directly. No joke. She waited for his answer, and the guy was now sweating bullets from nervousness. The girl decided to establish the rules and came up with the best way to do it. The protagonist suddenly remembered a passage from a novel and a plan to establish a hierarchy formed in her mind. So she pushed him away to make him understand who was boss. Then she told him that from now on, Romeo had to call her captain. Romeo was clearly not ready for that, and he didn't understand why he had to call her that when he was the one who had leverage on her. She put on a confident look, implying that Romeo was on the path to becoming her enemy. It seemed her tone, choice of words, and entire aura did the trick. Romeo might have wanted to argue, but he didn't dare. But he definitely didn't want to call Ray captain. He promised not to tell anyone, but in exchange, he wanted to know more about demons. The boy wanted to know if people who acted like Oscar did today were really not possessed. The girl agreed to tell Romeo whatever he wanted to hear. Having gotten the deal he wanted, Romeo thanked her quietly and, in the end, called her captain. The incident was over, and the protagonist could finally breathe a sigh of relief. She scratched her head, unable to figure out how the future hero had started taking orders from her. Meanwhile, Oscar had woken up and was resting in his room. The monk wanted to know if the rumors were true. Did Crown Prince Rio really hit Oscar? The child said it was true and was about to add something. But the news shocked the priestess. How could one crown prince hit another? Oscar realized they had misunderstood and tried to explain the whole story. He focused on recalling the expression on Rio's face. Now, the child was completely sure of one thing. Crown Prince Rio was trying to help him snap out of his hallucination. The next morning, when our protagonist woke up, she found Romeo hanging around her. She still wasn't quite comfortable with the idea of him being her subordinate. It felt a bit creepy that Romeo would just waltz into her room to chat. The blonde kid's actions felt too casual and strange. Judging by the knock on the door, someone else had decided to visit the crown prince early in the morning. Rio wanted Romeo to get the door since he was his subordinate. The blonde boy just stared blankly at his captain, not understanding why he was being glared at. After a few seconds of silence, he slammed his book shut with a thump, annoyed, and complained about being interrupted at a good part. He went to open the door. Seeing this, Rilia realized she might have gone a bit too far with the subordinate thing. Romeo, for his part, assumed it was some cleric coming to drag them to prayers. But when he saw who was at the door, the guy immediately got angry. The girl couldn't see who the visitor was, but Romeo was already in the person's face. Asking what he wanted, Rilia walked to the door and saw the visitor was Oscar Hresfeld. Romeo doubled down, demanding to know why the kid was here. Oscar looked terrified and couldn't say a word. Rilia stood in front of Romeo and told him not to scare their guest, even if he showed up for no reason. The blonde boy was still annoyed with the uninvited guest, but he decided not to argue with his captain and went inside to sit at the table. Oscar said he came to thank Ray for his help yesterday. Rilia could tell the kid was very embarrassed, so she told him there was no need to thank her and to just forget about it. In fact, from the very beginning, the protagonist just wanted to pretend nothing had happened. She hadn't rushed to help right away either, because she herself had been hesitant. The thanks made the girl feel uncomfortable all over, so she changed the subject and invited Oscar to have something to eat with her. She wanted to share the snacks, but it felt a bit weird since Romeo had brought them. It seemed this generosity did not please the blonde kid. He got up from his sofa and walked over to Oscar, seeming to want to figure something out. The blonde kid noticed that the boy had started stuttering badly after his episode, which was a bit suspicious. The girl thought this guy was being incredibly inconsiderate. Seeing that he had caused an argument, Oscar tried to answer. The child said that he only stutters when he's very nervous. This answer annoyed Romeo even more, and he started mocking Oscar. Relia couldn't take it anymore and demanded that he stop acting like a jerk. For her friends, hearing Rio call Oscar a friend made the crown prince feel embarrassed. The blonde boy pointed at the kid and asked how anyone could be friends with him. Then he reminded her that he had already told her he didn't like this guy. Rio had had enough, and he stood up, slamming his hands on the table. The captain's outburst immediately shut the blonde bully up. He turned around and stormed out of the room in a huff. Judging by the slam of the door, the blonde kid was really pissed off. She already thought Romeo was a bit silly, but she didn't expect him to run off like that. The protagonist tried to calm herself down, mentally chanting that Romeo was just a kid, which meant she now had to apologize to Oscar on the blonde kid's behalf. Ray tried to explain that Romeo was actually a good person, even if it was hard to believe. Oscar thought the whole conversation was a lie, which surprised her. Oscar looked into the distance and mentioned that he didn't have any friends. The child believed that someone who stuttered like him would never be liked by anyone. These words stung Relia deeply, and she struggled to find the right words to say. The girl felt like she was talking to a small child. A small child shouldn't talk about himself like that, especially so calmly. She tried to carefully formulate her response. Ray said that Oscar could very well start by being friends with him, since he tried to help him yesterday. The child didn't expect this offer and looked at the protagonist with a scrutinizing gaze. He didn't believe Ray would have helped him if he had known beforehand that he stuttered. The girl told him she would have helped him anyway. No one had ever treated the crown prince like this before, so Oscar didn't answer right away. He gathered his courage and, still stuttering, thanked Ray. Afterwards, Oscar asked if Ray knew his name. Ray knew it very well, so she immediately replied that he was the crown prince of the Hresvolg Empire. Afterwards, the protagonist regretted attracting the attention of the second main character of the novel, even though she just wanted to live without being noticed by anyone. The protagonist was caught off guard when Oscar asked why Romeo called him captain. The girl lied, saying that Romeo saw her comforting Oscar, and that's why he started respecting her so much. Hearing this, Oscar asked if he could also call Relia captain. The child was clearly embarrassed by his request, but he repeated it anyway. It seemed the girl's life here was only going to get weirder. She remembered a scene from the novel where Oscar became a bloodthirsty emperor after taking revenge on his father for his mother's murder. At that time, he swore to his father that from that moment on, everyone who stood in his way would fear him. Thinking of this memory, the protagonist felt a little scared about becoming Oscar's captain. The boy completely misunderstood her hesitation, thinking her reluctance was because of yesterday's episode. When Ray said the episode had nothing to do with it, Oscar then thought it was his stuttering problem. The protagonist retorted sharply that his stutter had nothing to do with it either. The word captain just brings up some very bad memories, like death breathing down my neck. But Oscar had no idea what was causing it. She had to struggle with all her might to squeeze out the next words. But even so, she couldn't bring herself to say the words Oscar longed to hear. In the end, if it was that important to Oscar, he finally got permission to call Ray captain. Thanks to Ray's unexpected approval, his mood immediately soared to the heavens. After calming down, she added that Oscar could call Ray whatever he wanted. Relia studied the happy and carefree crown prince for a long time. He was over the moon with joy, especially since a second ago he thought Ray hated his guts. For her, this admission was like discovering some brand new truth. After that, the atmosphere between them became super awkward. Oscar interpreted the silence as the protagonist disliking him. To clear things up, she blurted out that she liked Oscar a lot. The child relaxed, very happy to hear that someone actually liked him. It seemed they could finally end this conversation. The protagonist was still a little afraid they would find out her secret, but she felt much calmer now. She noticed that both crown princes were very handsome, and Oscar was simply an angel. Oscar declared that from now on, he would always rely on his captain. And so, the protagonist was approaching the moment of total chaos in the temple. Powerful enemies were gathering, preparing to eliminate one of the crown princes. And just like that, the assassins received permission to carry out the emperor's ruthless plan. The next morning, Romeo caught up to Rio with a big smile, asking if he slept well. The blonde boy also wanted to know why Rio hadn't called him for breakfast. This sudden change in the blonde boy's behavior certainly raised eyebrows among the other students. What's more, another uninvited guest, was about to join their little group. Oscar also walked up to Relia and asked if the captain had slept well. The child clearly wasn't backing down in front of Romeo and announced that he would be joining them for breakfast too. Romeo voiced his objection and said so bluntly, which only made everyone's stares more intense. The girl stood there in horror, watching it all unfold, trying to figure out how things had turned out this way. Looking back on the events of the past few days, she realized this chaos was no one's fault but her own. Relia was snapped out of her thoughts when the boys finally repeated their questions. They stared at Ray in perfect sync, worried about why he was so quiet. The girl glanced at her unexpected new friends, still unsure what to do with them. Relia said she was just hungry, and that's when Romeo remembered something. He realized there was an event at the temple tonight. It was probably something where all the students needed to gather and do something. It was a tradition to help the children overcome their fear of the dark. The whole group had to climb a mountain and work together to overcome their fear of demons. Once the children reached the right spot, they would light an exorcism candle and then descend. They had to climb with a partner so they could conquer their fear of demons together. The monks said not to worry, as only small animals lived on that mountain. Some were excited about the challenge, but others were afraid of hiking at night. Romeo asked the captain who he was going to team up with. Ray said he would go alone, and Oscar would be Romeo's partner. Romeo wasn't happy about it, but Oscar was happy to accept any order from his captain. So the two guys had to accept the fact that they had to work together. Before they separated, Romeo checked with the captain again, asking if he was sure there were no demons. The girl told Romeo he had nothing to worry about and should absolutely not be afraid of any demons. Oscar carefully added that he didn't believe in demons either and wasn't afraid of them. Romeo looked terrified and declared that he wasn't afraid of a loser like Oscar. Rio wondered why Romeo looked like he'd just seen a ghost. The girl knew Oscar wasn't afraid of demons because his father was much scarier than any demon. Demons hide in the dark, but his old man killed people right in front of him when he was just a child. In that respect, Oscar was a lot like Rilia's character. The darkness had always been with her, and back then she was only afraid of one thing. She didn't want to starve to death in some forgotten dungeon. Romeo tried to prove something to Oscar, but the kid didn't care at all what the blonde boy said. The girl felt it was futile to avoid the characters from the novel, feeling like they had become a part of her life, like real friends. She really didn't want to screw up what was supposed to happen tonight, because tonight, a pack of wolves would appear on the mountain with a single goal, to eliminate one of the crown princes. The protagonist knew that if she told the monks about this, no one would believe her. This meant she had to somehow stop this tragedy on her own. The two crown princes wandered in the forest for a long time, but they still couldn't find the cabin. One of the boys realized they were completely lost. He blamed the other for being too careless and letting them stray from the path. The other completely disagreed, insisting he hadn't made any mistakes. Just then, the guy tripped on a tree root. He lost his balance and started to fall. He fell hard, and a sharp pain shot through his ankle. To make matters worse, he broke the lantern when he fell. The whole thing devolved into an argument, because without a lantern, it would be much harder to walk in the dark. Griffith thought Calix's excuse was complete nonsense. Calix was angry and wasn't about to put up with that crap. A few seconds later, the two guys were fighting. Fortunately, the fight didn't last long, but unfortunately, the two didn't intend to calm down either. A bruised Griffith said they were now in a very stupid situation. They had just wasted a whole bunch of time and decided to part ways right there. Calix was convinced it wasn't his fault they got lost. Seeing his partner walk away, Calix just yelled after him that Griffith was a coward. Now our girl was discovering something that was barely mentioned in the book. Griffith looked back and said that they had argued over something stupid that day. Both men regretted that little squabble, which led to Calix being left alone in the woods. The kid then realized that the fall was not without consequences. With an injured ankle and no flashlight, there was no way he could get out on his own. He figured he'd just hunker down until morning so he wouldn't get more lost or fall again. Suddenly, Calix heard a sound nearby. At first, he thought Griffith had gotten scared of being alone and came back for him. But when he turned around, he saw a glowing hand reaching out from the bushes. It was a downright creepy sight that would have scared anyone. For a few seconds after seeing it, the kid just froze, paralyzed by fear. Suddenly, the hand told him that it wasn't Griffith. This scared Calix even more, and he almost screamed out loud. At this critical moment, Relia realized her clothes had gotten snagged on a bush. She struggled desperately, trying to free herself from the damn thing. Just then, she felt someone staring intently at her. She barely managed to. As she turned around, she saw Calix lunging at her from above, shouting that the demon must be eliminated. Then, she felt a hard kick in her back, and a few seconds later, Calix realized it was Crown Prince Ray standing before him. Calix quickly added that he saw Ray stepping up and starting to act like a leader, and Ray replied that thank God, Calix had finally figured out he wasn't facing a demon. The female protagonist told the Crown Prince that they had to leave the mountain as soon as possible, like right now. But the kid had no idea why Ray was in such a hurry to go. He plopped down on the ground, making it clear he wasn't going anywhere, as the guy thought hiking in the mountains at night in his condition was just crazy. They would be much better off staying here until morning, which suddenly angered the female protagonist, who decided he was just an ignorant and carefree little brat. She had come all this way just to save him from the tragedy of losing an arm, and the girl felt she had to tell the Crown Prince the truth about tonight. So she told him that a pack of wolves would appear on the mountain tonight, and she wasn't kidding, but Calix naturally didn't believe a word of it. She thought to herself that it seemed she had to take drastic measures, and a few seconds later, the girl decided to ask a crucial question. She wanted to know how much the Crown Prince trusted his uncle, and this question was like a switch for Calix, who jumped up and lunged at Relia. He cursed Ray as a little bastard, his eyes burning with rage, and Calix demanded Ray tell him immediately who had sent him. The girl didn't understand why Calix reacted so violently to the question, so Ray showed his insignia and reminded him that he was the Crown Prince of Auraria, sent by the Emperor of Auraria. It seemed this explanation and the insignia calmed him down, as Calix initially thought his uncle had sent Ray, but now that was clearly impossible. Relia had told the Crown Prince that she had a strong intuition about things, and that the Calix Empire had long suffered under the Emperor's iron-fisted rule, with the people unable to make a living. The government squeezed everyone so hard they couldn't breathe, preventing them from living a decent life, and while Calix saw his uncle as family, to his uncle, Calix was just a thorn in his side. Because Calix could contend for the throne, his uncle wanted to get rid of him before that could happen, and Calix realized that according to Ray, the Emperor was going to release wolves against him tonight. Ray said that was exactly right, and even though it sounded crazy, Calix just sneered, not taking Ray's words seriously at all. Then Calix said that if that was the case, he should just give up and wait to die. As it turned out, the kid had long expected that the Emperor might want to get rid of him. So everything was fine. The Crown Prince would die exactly as his dear uncle wished, and after that, Calix collapsed to the ground, telling Ray to get the hell out before the beasts appeared. He ignored Relia, adding that this was a family matter and a prince from another country should get lost immediately. But the female protagonist couldn't just leave a child here to die. She wasn't sure if her appearance had already disrupted the novel's main plotline, as the Crown Prince was now at risk of losing not just his arm, but his entire life. Now the female protagonist had to make another difficult decision, as she knew Calix was just using a tough guy facade to hide his immense fear. Seeing that Ray wasn't leaving, Calix started threatening him to get lost, but Ray looked indifferent, as if whether he stayed or left was his own decision, not because he was being chased away. It seemed this response further provoked Calix's fear and anger. A moment later, Relia made it clear that she would not be leaving here alone. She told Calix to hang on a little longer, and upon seeing someone walking towards him with a huge club, Calix was completely terrified. A second later, Calix passed out, which the female protagonist was happy about, because she didn't want to hit him again, but the female protagonist's plan had one major flaw. It turned out Calix was much heavier than Relia had originally thought, and worst of all, the girl had no idea where to go. She decided to follow the moonlight along the path, but wasn't sure if it was the right choice, and the thought that she couldn't find her way out because she was under the influence of magic started to scare her, and a few seconds later, she heard a noise in the bushes that sounded like a wolf, but it was actually a person, and the first thing he wanted to know was what Ray was doing here. And it turned out to be Griffith, carrying a lit lantern, and she couldn't figure out how he got here because the book said he had abandoned his companion and left that day. The protagonist introduced himself as the Crown Prince of Auraria, but Griffith only cared about why Ray was here, and Relia said it was a long story, and they were short on time. Ray added that the wolf pack would appear soon, but Griffith thought that was impossible, so she reiterated that they had to get down the mountain as soon as possible, and he could doubt her later. Griffith pointed out that all the paths were a maze, which was no news to her. She was just hoping to find a way out, and the guy couldn't understand all this strange behavior from the Crown Prince of Auraria. A second later, Griffith announced that he had found the way, news that was both delightful and completely unexpected. The guy pointed to the fireflies that were powering his lamp, and the girl was surprised again, because the book said Griffith could see in the dark, without any problem, as it was a birthright of the royal family. But in the novel, the kid had abandoned his friend after the lamp went out, and just then, Griffith asked Ray why he was dragging Calix, and she replied that Calix had fainted from fear. It seemed Griffith was completely satisfied with this answer, as he thought Calix was an arrogant weakling anyway, and the girl thought to herself that even if Griffith was a bastard, he was a good person for coming back for Calix. In the original story, these two guys met by complete chance, and this thought made really a chuckle with a villainous "I know everything" aura. "Hey, stop laughing so weirdly," Griffith said to her, and it seemed this guy named Griffith was not the Prince Charming that novel readers imagined. Now she was even more convinced that this guy was an upright and good person, and afterwards, the protagonist asked Griffith to lead her out of here as soon as possible. Griffith sighed and said they just needed to follow the light of the fireflies, and in the blink of an eye, the girl was consumed by fear. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a huge wolf appear beside her, and Griffith reacted quickly, trying to get in front of Ray to protect the crown princess from the beast. But he wasn't fast enough, and the female protagonist felt a sharp pain in her abdomen as blood immediately started to drip and the girl was seized by fear. But that didn't mean she was going to abandon Calix and run. And a moment later, Griffith, stunned by the sudden appearance of the wolf pack, was already standing in front of them. The wolves were extremely aggressive, and the princes couldn't immediately tell how many enemies had surrounded them, as it felt like the number of wolves was doubling every second. Griffith couldn't figure out how there could be wolves in this forest, and the girl tried to get Griffith's attention so he could help her, as she needed him to blow her whistle, the kind used by the priests, and she added in a firm voice that he had to do it as soon as possible. Griffith glanced at Crown Prince Ray, and though it was only for a second, he was surprised that the injured Crown Prince could remain so calm and fearless, as Ray's eyes were full of confidence, as if everything was under control. But inside, the girl was terrified to the core, her legs feeling like jelly. She knew that even if the whistle worked, the priest wouldn't appear immediately, and as Griffith jumped to Ray's side and blew the whistle, a faint glimmer of hope appeared. Even so, someone was watching them and using magic, the very person who planned to eliminate the Crown Prince, and he saw the kids calling for backup. Really, I hoped this would scare off the attacker and make them retreat with the wolves. But the whistle didn't last long, as one of the wolves lunged at the princes. Griffith took the attack like a champ, holding the stick in front of him, and his lightning-fast reaction stopped the wolf's attack in its tracks. Just then, another wolf pounced on the kid, and Griffith didn't even have time to turn around before the beast finally bit into the prince's arm, and it all happened so fast that the female protagonist felt completely helpless. Then, with a bang, magical energy suddenly surrounded Griffith, and Relia saw that the boy was now standing in the middle of a magic circle. According to the story, the prince wasn't supposed to gain this power so early, and it seemed the pressure had changed everything, and Griffith seemed just as shocked by this power-up. Just then, Calix started to wake up, complaining about the noise and the bright light, and opening his eyes, the crown prince couldn't figure out what was happening, with Griffith standing right in front of him, his arm covered in blood. And what's more, there was a pack of wolves nearby, clearly looking for trouble, and Ray tried to calm the crown prince down after he woke up. But Calix immediately demanded to be let go and pushed her away, and since he was much stronger than her, he easily broke free from her grasp. A second later, he was on his feet, though it clearly caused him a lot of pain, and he glanced at the wolf pack and quickly made a decision. One of the wolves immediately pounced on the kid and knocked him down, and the girl saw blood fly, knowing that Calix wouldn't survive this time. All the kids could do was watch as the wolf killed the crown prince, powerless to do anything. And in the original story, Calix lost an arm, but he mastered a great sword and played a key role in the dragon-slaying battle. But he paid too heavy a price for that victory, and if only for that reason, she wanted to protect the future hero's hand. That was the only thing she wanted, and she felt that Calix was almost killed today because she hadn't trained him properly. Suddenly, she heard Calix's voice. He was still alive, and he had managed to push the wolf off himself, still trying to figure out what the hell was going going on. Relia saw that Calix was holding a dagger, the one he used for self-defense, and she was stunned that the prince had taken down a wolf with just a small, ordinary dagger. After finishing off the wolf, he said his friends should have warned him that the wolves were real, and Relia thought he was a complete and utter idiot, as she had clearly warned him about the real wolves. Griffith felt they had more important things to do than argue about whether the wolves were real, as they had only taken down a few, and most of the damn wolves were still alive. Just then, the mage who had been leisurely watching the show nearby cast a new spell, and immediately the wolves began to act very strangely, and their appearance became even weirder, and a few seconds later, all the remaining wolves turned into sand, and Griffith witnessed the whole thing, but he couldn't understand what had just happened. The female protagonist interjected that the attacker had decided to erase all evidence of what had happened here, and now Griffith was convinced that someone was controlling the wolves from behind the scenes. The Crown Prince realized that the whistle was supposed to make the attacker retreat, and Griffith was right this time, but the girl wasn't going to confirm or deny anything. He said the only thing Griffith couldn't figure out was who the attacker's target was, while Calix was completely sure that the mercenaries were after him. The sand-turning magic was something only his empire used, and he was holding that very evidence in his hand. This meant only one thing to Crown Prince Calix, that his dear uncle had really tried to kill him today. The girl could see how messed up the guy was right now, and she wanted to say something to comfort him, but couldn't find the right words. And the female protagonist knew she had to bring him back to reality as soon as possible. To be honest, she was secretly relieved that Calix was alive and hadn't lost his hand, but Ray still felt it was too dangerous here, so he told Calix to get on his back. He once again told the others that they needed to get down the mountain as soon as possible, but Griffith thought he should be the one to carry Calix. Relia objected, because that guy had a huge wound on his arm, and looking at Calix, the girl added that she didn't have the strength to knock him out again. The guy was still angry at himself and the Emperor, though he was really trying to pull himself together, and as Ray tried to get Calix on his back, Griffith absent-mindedly rebandaged his own arm. Only after Calix was finally on Ray's back could they start moving, and it was only then that Calix noticed that his left ankle, which was sore from his fall, now had a matching pain in his right ankle. It turned out Ray had accidentally stepped on it after knocking the Crown Prince out, and Griffith had thought those two would die from exhaustion. But now, they looked like a couple of buddies who had just had a good night's sleep, and it seemed the two had bonded while the wolves were trying to have them for lunch. The long-awaited morning arrived, but the atmosphere at the temple camp was tense, as the priests were sweating bullets because the two crown princes had not yet returned, and Romeo and Oscar chimed in that Rio had gone up the mountain alone and hadn't come back either. Oscar was worried that something had happened to all the missing crown princes, and then he saw some figures in the distance. Oscar immediately recognized one of them as the captain, and Relia looked exhausted, while Crown Prince Calix was fast asleep on her back. Realizing the mission was complete and everyone was safe, she finally allowed herself to rest, and everything before her eyes became a blur, but she could make out that the priests had spotted them. A few seconds later, the girl passed out, and our girl heard someone crying softly nearby, so she forced her eyes open. Oscar's tear-streaked face came into view, and he immediately asked if their captain was okay, while she was still trying to figure out why Oscar was standing here with tears in his eyes. The kid replied that he was crying because his captain was injured, and Romeo explained that Relia was in the temple. After the captain woke up, Oscar decided to go get a priest, and it was only then that she remembered everything that had happened and immediately asked how the others were. Oscar said the crown princes were now meeting with the priests, and they had gone there right after receiving treatment. And just then, the priestess appeared and asked how Ray was feeling. Relia quickly replied that she was fine, and she touched the wound and found that it didn't hurt at all, not even a slight twinge of pain. This meant the wound on her abdomen had completely healed, and a chill of panic ran down the female protagonist's spine at the thought that her clothes were still intact. The priestess understood what the girl was going through and why it was impossible not to have discovered she was a girl, not Prince Ray, when changing her clothes. Seeing the captain's sudden mood shift, Oscar started to worry about him again, and the priestess whispered in Relia's ear that she was the one who had changed her clothes, so the girl had nothing to worry about, and as far as everyone knew, Relia's secret was still buried. The woman swore she wouldn't breathe a word to anyone, which almost put the female protagonist at ease, though she was still trembling a little. Ray had to once again reassure his companions that he was fine, but before the girl could even catch her breath, more visitors arrived. It was Calix and Griffith who both said that Ray looked fine, and seeing these two guys was a huge relief to her. She noticed that Griffith's hand had completely healed, and Calix was also safe and sound. And most importantly, both of his hands were still there. In that moment, Relia felt like the luckiest person in the world, as the four heroes were finally together, all safe and sound, and she couldn't ask for anything more. Griffith thought Ray needed to see the High Priest, as their group planned to file a formal complaint with the temple about what had happened. The whole thing was rapidly heading in a bad direction, so Ray wasn't sure how to react, because you see, she was well aware of the consequences the incident would have for the temple and the heroes. In the original story, all 5 great empires were alerted to the attack on Calix, which led to a full-scale investigation, and the situation got completely out of hand as Calix's uncle tried to cover the whole thing up as quickly as possible. The 5 kingdoms joined forces with the temple and mobilized their armies. And in the end, the temple apologized to each empire and heavily reinforced security with their warriors. All of this was very troubling for Calix, who was already dealing with the blow of losing his arm. And in the original story, Calix knew his uncle was plotting to get rid of him. But the kid couldn't trust anyone, so he ended up all alone. And the other kids also began to distance themselves from the future hero because his life was in danger. Ray asked if anyone else knew what happened on the mountain, and if no one knew now, it was best to keep it that way. You know, the guys didn't understand why Ray wouldn't report this information to the Empire, and Romeo and Oscar were also baffled by their captain's decision. Ray just looked at Calix with an intense gaze, and the girl knew he was bottling everything up, and in the original story, Calix turned his back on the throne and became a king of mercenaries. And the key thing is, right now this badass character was just a 10-year-old kid, and to protect Calix from any fallout, the whole thing had to be covered up, which Griffith couldn't possibly know. So he still didn't understand why Ray was objecting, and it was a simple and direct question that was extremely difficult to answer. But the female protagonist came up with a solution, saying the problem was that if her father found out, they'd be dead, because Ray's father was so overprotective that he kissed her every day and couldn't sleep without holding the prince. This description of her father left the princes shocked and terrified, so she achieved the desired effect, as if her father found out, he would be furious, and the crown princess understood the danger. Calix said he had no intention of making a big deal out of it anyway, and since Calix was fine with it, Griffith also decided not to cause trouble. But Romeo wouldn't let it go, yelling at the captain that he must have hit his head, because Ray had almost died, and the blonde kid continued to scream that the captain's brain was completely fried and had gotten worse after being bitten by a wolf. Relia couldn't take her friend's breakdown anymore, and yelled at him to shut his crow's mouth, which worked on Romeo, who finally stopped yelling. A second later, Romeo announced that he couldn't defy this idiot captain and turned to storm towards the exit. A moment later, Relia's door slammed shut. Relia was stunned by the blonde kid's behavior, and she had a strong sense of deja vu, and Oscar asked the captain to calm down, reminding him that while Romeo was difficult, he was good-natured at heart, and the kid pointed out that the captain needed to act like an adult, not a toddler, while Calix and Griffith silently watched Ray talk with his friends. As soon as they had a chance, the two guys asked why these princes called Ray captain, and the girl explained that it wasn't a game, it was just what the guys had decided to call her, and there was nothing she could do about it. This answer took the two guys by surprise, and they exchanged a silent look, and suddenly, a smug look appeared on their faces because they had a plan in mind. Griffith announced that they also wanted to call Ray captain, news that sent a shiver down Relia's spine because this was really bad. But the two guys had already made up their minds, and now they were under Captain Ray's command, and Relia tried to change their minds. But it was no use, and a few days later, the high priest came to the kids and personally apologized for the incident. The temple officials promised to thoroughly investigate the attack and swore it would never happen again. But of course, the investigation would lead nowhere because the temple was in league with the Emperor of Ascadia, and a few days later, Romeo demanded that no one come near his side of the place. Oscar tried to explain to the blonde kid that he was the one invading personal space, always hogging the bed and rolling around, and Griffith felt that Romeo just needed to buy a damn bigger bed. It was that simple. Calix had had enough of this crap and just wanted the whole argument to end so he could go back to his book, and for our protagonist, the whole situation in front of her felt too surreal. I mean, all this complaining and bickering was happening in Crown Prince Ray's bedroom, and Relia couldn't understand why all the heroes had suddenly dragged their beds into her room and were begging. Ray sleeps with them. In the end, the girl stormed right out of her own bedroom. How on earth was she supposed to sleep in the same room as these crown princes? The thought of having to sleep with the 4 male leads gave Relia a splitting headache. She knew she had severely disrupted the plot, but she had no idea what to do about it. All she could do was hope that everything would go smoothly and they wouldn't find out the truth about her. But even if things went perfectly, in 3 years, that day would eventually come, and it would be the end of their entire team. Recently, the protagonist started to notice the girls looking at her with strange eyes. Relia overheard the girls talking about his status as captain and had even memorized his name. As the Prince of Auraria, the girls were all thrilled that this guy had become a true captain and united all the crown princes. It seemed that Ray would have to live like this in the temple for 3 years, surrounded by so much attention and students who were always blushing around him. One of the girls noticed the prince sitting alone, which was a bit strange, and she felt this was definitely her chance to make a move. She walked towards Ray and, upon getting closer, asked if the child before her was really the crown prince of the Aurarian Empire. After hearing him confirm it, she moved even closer. She needed to talk to this man. It turned out her father was Count Shurdai's, and she was from the Nizhan Empire. Honestly, that name and the empire it belonged to meant nothing to her. So as not to be rude, Relia just smiled and asked what she wanted with him. The Count's daughter hadn't expected such a direct question and was flustered for a moment. Then, in a trembling voice, she said that she wanted to get closer to Ray. She pointed out that the prince mostly stayed with the boys. She was very impressed that his companions called Relia captain, and our girl didn't even know how to respond to the statement. Ray just shrugged and said nonchalantly that it didn't matter what others called him. The girl wouldn't give up, and Relia racked her brain for a way to get rid of her. Soon, the protagonist realized her popularity was skyrocketing daily, and it was an absolute disaster. Relia now wanted to punch someone in the face, especially the main culprit who had made her famous. These 4 leech-like princes were the reason she couldn't spend 3 years peacefully in the temple. She remembered the sleepy-eyed princes barging into her room almost every morning. Seriously, this group followed Relia around constantly, not leaving her alone for a second. And they called her captain at the drop of a hat, which was why her popularity among the girls had exploded. That's why Relia woke up especially early today. She desperately needed some time alone. Although, with all the loving gazes directed at her, being completely alone was impossible. The other Aurarians had never seen the real Rio, but the protagonist knew the prince's reckless side like the back of her hand. None of that mattered, though, because they wouldn't be compared in the future. In the end, a girl's got to do what she thinks is best, right? Soon, after the protagonist returned from the temple, the emperor and the crown prince would be taken out in a rebellion. Relia didn't even have time to think about what she would do during the uprising, because the girl's voice pulled her back from her thoughts. She clearly wanted to ask Ray something, but was extremely shy. Getting her to say what she wanted to ask was like pulling teeth. Relia decided to give her a push, telling her not to hold back. The girl blurted out a single word, as if completely by accident, then took a sharp breath. Then, on the exhale, she rushed out the question in a huge voice, asking if Griffith had ever mentioned her. This was definitely not a question the protagonist expected to hear. It turned out that Griffith was engaged to this furiously blushing girl. The news was a bolt from the blue, and now it was the protagonist's turn to blush furiously herself. Relia steadied herself and retorted that no one was talking about her and that they definitely weren't discussing girls. Heaven knows how this strange conversation would have ended, but Rio overheard some familiar voices. The usual crew walked into the dining hall, very annoyed that their captain had slipped away without them this time. Calix was the most upset, while Romeo wasn't fully awake yet. The girl was frustrated that those leeches had managed to get up and even follow her here. As the guys approached, Griffith noticed a familiar girl next to the captain. The bride-to-be realized her future husband was staring at her at that very moment. She immediately turned, ran off in a flash, and shouted as she fled that they would talk next time. The beet-red girl sped past the princes, finally startling Romeo wide awake. Oscar was very curious about the girl who had just run by, and Romeo guessed it might be the captain's woman. Calix didn't quite believe the girl who ran off was the captain's girlfriend. He just couldn't figure out how such a great beauty would fall for their captain. Oscar immediately explained to Calix that their captain was the best, so of course he could have a girlfriend. Romeo chimed in that it seemed everyone except Calix knew how popular the captain was among the girls at the temple. The protagonist could only sigh, accepting the reality of her popularity and the prince's foolishness. Oscar asked sadly, "Is it true? Is that really the captain's woman?" It seemed this question was really bothering the shyest crown prince. The protagonist immediately replied that it was impossible for him to be that girl's boyfriend, as it would cause big trouble. The problem was that girl was actually engaged to Prince Griffith. Calix was stunned. "No way. Griffith already has a fiancée?" Griffith just said casually that at this age, everyone here should be engaged. Romeo muttered in complete shock that he didn't have one, and neither did Oscar. The protagonist realized these guys were very hung up on the fact that Griffith had a fiancée. She thought to herself that the only ones without fiancés were the ones hated by the emperor. Romeo grew curious. What about their captain? Did he have a fiancée? The question caught her off guard, and she had no idea how to answer. Romeo was sure the captain must have a fiancée. There was no way he didn't. Relia still couldn't think of an answer, which started to make her look suspicious. The guy desperately wanted to know just what kind of girl could capture their captain's attention. Now the whole table was intrigued, wanting to know if the captain had a girlfriend or not. Relia had absolutely no idea how to answer the crown princes, and the situation was super awkward. I mean, the protagonist had no idea if Ray had a fiancée. The novel didn't mention a single thing about it. The girl was sweating nervously, afraid that giving the wrong answer would drastically change the future. In theory, Rio should have a fiancée, since the emperor doted on his son. But since Hashi was sent to the temple, Rio might have cut off his social life and remained single. Relia came up with a clever answer, saying that they hadn't brought up a fiancé yet because he was still weak. Meanwhile, Rio had once overheard his father talking to someone about arranging a marriage for him. Believe it or not, the princes bought their captain's BS without a shred of doubt. But Calix was suspicious that the captain would call himself weak, especially after he had dragged him across the mountains. Rio explained that it was a critical situation, and he honestly didn't know how he managed to carry Calix. And frankly, Calix should be grateful for the immense effort he put in to save his sorry hide. To save him, Calix started to get angry, while Romeo looked at the captain with a very strange expression. He was curious if Rio would have saved him if it had been Romeo in Calix's place. Relia was surprised by the question. After all, Romeo was her first friend at the temple. To reassure the blonde boy, the protagonist confirmed that she would have dragged him off that mountain too. Oscar immediately chimed in, asking if the captain would have dragged him out of that forest as well. Rio replied that Oscar was younger than him, so he would have definitely saved him. Seeing Oscar's happy face, the girl was very pleased with her answer. The kid was glad he wouldn't be left in the mountains to be fed to the wolves, right? Then, Oscar suddenly looked like a little fairy in her eyes again. She wondered how Oscar could be so cute, and how he could possibly be older than her. Relia thought that she probably just saw Oscar as her younger brother. Noticing they had the same hair color, she decided to voice her thoughts. She felt that strangers might mistake her and Oscar for siblings. These words were both unexpected and very sweet to the kid's ears. Calix was not happy about the two of them acting like blood brothers now. Calix thought that such an idea could lead to a national-level bloodbath. Romeo felt that their captain had definitely said too much this time. Hearing the Crown Prince's reactions, she felt she had gone a bit too far, but Oscar was overjoyed at that moment. The girl noticed something important. Griffith had been sitting there silently the whole time, not saying a word. This guy was always the quietest one in their group anyway. She thought the Crown Prince looked like a lost puppy. He was following them now, but he was always so aloof and distant. This annoyed Relia. She needed to solidify Griffith's place in their group. And soon, she turned to the kid, who clearly didn't expect her to notice him. She told him that if he had been in Calix's place, she would have dragged him out of the woods too. The kid was surprised by this, though he tried to play it cool. Afterward, Relia added that Griffith certainly wouldn't have complained about being carried. But before Griffith could say anything, Calix blew up over the comment about complaining. After the whole fiasco with Calix was over, she noticed Griffith's expression had softened considerably. Griffith just said that, he hadn't actually asked to be carried. Relia quickly changed the subject, suggesting they eat. Romeo didn't understand why the captain wanted to eat, especially since he had just eaten before coming here. These guys could never understand why their captain always ate so much and how he could stomach it all. The rest of the day passed peacefully. While everyone was sound asleep, Oscar was once again plagued by that nightmare. He woke up with a jolt, fear still gripping him. The prince couldn't calm down or even catch his breath. The kid covered his face with his hands, trying to stop the trembling inside him. The captain's words, saying everything was okay and that he was safe, replayed in his mind. This helped Oscar calm down a bit, but he couldn't fall back asleep. In the complete silence, he hugged himself and cried silently, begging for the captain's help, but the captain was too far away to hear. The next day was a day off, so everyone was discussing the day's activities. Romeo suggested a walk outside the temple, since they were always stuck within these four walls. Calix thought Romeo was suggesting a walk in the garden, but he was dead wrong. Romeo actually wanted to visit the market area in a neutral zone behind the temple. Griffith pointed out that although it was far from the temple, it was still worth a visit. The protagonist wasn't sure if the priest would let all of them just go into town. It seemed Romeo already had a plan. He pointed out that everyone had kept their mouths shut about the attack in the mountains, so the temple owed them one for saving its reputation. Romeo planned to use this to his advantage, as they now had a reason to ask for anything from the temple. The blonde boy felt they would be allowed to go and would be given guards for protection. The crown prince's proposal was exactly what our girl wanted, as she had never been anywhere besides the tower and the temple. So, as captain, she agreed that they would all go together. Hearing this, Oscar's expression completely changed. He definitely did not like this idea. In a trembling voice, the kid said he wanted to stay at the temple. Then he added that he was very sleepy, so the others should just go by themselves. With that, he stood up and walked straight towards the exit of the common room. The protagonist understood why the prince didn't want to leave the temple. She knew Oscar always panicked in crowded places. She had to think of something fast so the kid wouldn't feel left out. An idea to help Oscar quickly formed in her mind, and now she just had to put it into action. Romeo was annoyed. He didn't understand why Oscar would refuse such a great opportunity. To get out of the temple, the protagonist cut the blonde boy off, saying that if they were going, they should go now. The blonde boy didn't understand why Rio was suddenly in such a hurry to leave, especially when Oscar wasn't going. In fact, Romeo was worried about the kid and didn't want to leave him alone either. Seeing the blonde boy's reaction, Rio was even more convinced that Romeo was actually a very good person. Before long, the group arrived at the commercial district. My goodness, there were so many people. Relia hadn't seen this many people since she transmigrated. She was a bit overwhelmed at first and didn't even know where to go. Romeo pointed out that this place was nothing compared to the Roseberry commercial district. Calix wasn't too impressed either, but Griffith said at least it was clean. All around them, they could hear people gossiping about the visiting nobles. One of the guards told the princes to stick close to the group. Relia thanked the guard for the reminder and said they would be careful. The temple had sent 5 knights as guards, and they were only allowed to operate in the area closest to the temple. The girl started to think that she wanted to find something special here. In her search, our protagonist scanned the shop windows and finally spotted a place that looked promising. The princes wondered where their captain was going in such a hurry. They were completely baffled to see their captain heading towards a doll display. Meanwhile, the girl, with the entire team in tow, walked right into the toy store. The owner of the shop immediately greeted the customers. When the knights followed the kids inside, the owner started to panic a little, seeing that the knights were just escorts. The owner guessed he was hosting some royal children. The knights apologized to him for the unexpected visit and calmed him down. Relia walked over to the counter where the toy rabbits were. She picked one up, well aware that this might look suspicious, but the rabbit was just too cute. She couldn't take her eyes off it. Romeo couldn't believe the captain was serious about buying a doll here. Aren't dolls for girls? Rio looked a little annoyed and retorted that of course boys could like dolls too. Romeo wasn't going to argue, but Relia realized she had no money to buy the toy. It turned out Calix and Romeo had empty pockets too. Romeo just couldn't understand why princes would ever need to carry around actual cash. Hopefully, Relia asked the last person in their group. Luckily, Griffith had money, which made Rio excitedly call him the most reliable guy. Griffith even offered to let Rio get another doll if he wanted, and the prince would pay for it. Griffith seemed a little embarrassed by the captain's praise and just told them to hurry up and choose. Relia immediately grabbed another rabbit, identical to the first one, just in a different color. In the original story about the dolls, there were 2 parts, one of which was about a grown-up Oscar. Oscar fell madly in love with the female lead, but he confessed too late. She rejected the prince and gave him a doll as a memento. She told him it was her favorite doll, so she wanted to give it to Oscar as a thank you. In truth, Juliana always received so many toys that she gave them away casually. Even so, that doll became very special to the prince. It actually helped Oscar get rid of the nightmares that had plagued him his whole life. Obviously, this rabbit wouldn't have the same effect as a gift from the female lead, but Relia hoped the toy would help Oscar. Griffith, unlike the others, immediately guessed that the second rabbit was for Oscar. Calix and Romeo still had no idea why the captain needed two identical dolls. Upon hearing it was for Oscar, Calix pestered Griffith for money, wanting to buy a rabbit for himself too. But Griffith immediately rejected the request from Calix and Romeo. The princes were very frustrated at being rejected, calling Griffith a total jerk. They hoped the insult would work on the only guy who actually had money. Romeo and Calix stared him down with a death glare, not saying a word until he gave in. After finally getting his approval, they dashed off to pick their own dolls. The protagonist thought to herself again that things had gone seriously off track. Even so, she felt a warmth inside, knowing she would also have a doll of her own. She was happy because now she had something of her own, and it was something that connected her to these guys. The girl didn't even understand why she was so excited, since she had only wanted to help Oscar at first. Perhaps it was because Relia, the character she was, had always dreamed of having a doll of her own. For some reason, the girl felt that as long as she had that doll, nothing bad would happen to her. The second time a doll appeared in the plot was about Relia. Now, the protagonist in the novel, Juliana, was loved by almost everyone in the story. But she grew up in a very bad environment where her father constantly abused her. This would have continued if someone hadn't stepped in and stopped it. And that person was the guy everyone thought was dead. His name was Perseus Aurelia, and he was the former emperor of Aurelia. The emperor was framed by his younger brother, eventually losing his wife and being driven from the throne. Afterward, he fled with the twin princes and went into hiding for a long time. Juliana's mother ended up marrying Perseus, and together they began to plot to reclaim his throne. I guess you could say it was a political marriage, and Juliana became the emperor's adopted daughter. Perseus gathered his old allies and overthrew his younger brother 10 years after losing the throne. By then, the real Rio had already been killed by his own people, and the emperor had nothing to do with it. Juliana was now a princess in the palace, enjoying her new fairy tale life and wanting to get closer to Perseus. Perseus was like a real father to her, so she was always drawn to him. But one day, this led to a rather bad situation. Perseus pushed her away, and she fell to the ground, terrified by the sudden action. The emperor didn't mean to scare her, but he did. He had turned around too quickly and ended up hitting her arm. That injury caused severe emotional trauma for both Juliana and Perseus. After that, Juliana assumed her new father hated her guts. So Perseus tried to make up for it by buying her a huge toy. He handed her the toy, apologized, and explained that he just wasn't used to being touched. After giving her the teddy bear, Perseus begged Juliana for her forgiveness. The little girl quickly accepted her father's apology and calmed down immediately. She was relieved to know her father didn't hate her, and that toy became something she treasured. Seeing how happy the big bear made her, Perseus began to see Juliana in a whole new light. The same went for her older brothers, who watched from a distance, completely in love with their little sister. From then on, the brothers constantly showered her with all sorts of toys. Meanwhile, Relia was nowhere to be found in the story, as she had no real impact on anything. As a minor character, she lived in a tall tower where even the sunlight could barely reach. The emperor and his advisors didn't know what to do with the child of the man who had overthrown Perseus. Some wanted to kill Relia, seeing her as a potential threat to the throne. Others wanted to marry her off for political gain. At some point, all this chatter got on the emperor's nerves. He came back and said he didn't want to hear another word about the child, but allowed her to live in a distant tower. He didn't even care that his sister's daughter was starving all this time. He justified it by saying that Relia's mother was a villain who had tortured Perseus's late wife, Elizabeth. So Juliana had everything, but she remained a cheerful and kind girl. And Relia was a thin, haggard child who had nothing. The girl didn't even have the strength to hate, as all she felt was weakness and hunger. Relia ran to the woods outside the castle to find fruit, just to keep from starving to death. She was just an unremarkable background character, nothing special. That day would have been completely forgotten if she hadn't met Juliana in the forest. Juliana had left a picnic basket full of food in a clearing. The girl dashed towards the basket, ready to grab anything inside. Relia peeked inside and saw a large pile of cookies and some fruit. She knew she was in luck. Stealing someone else's food would get her into big trouble, but her hunger won out, and she reached for a cookie. She began to wolf them down one after another, as if there were no tomorrow. Just then, she heard a voice from somewhere, and pure fear seized her. At first, Relia didn't even notice Juliana sleeping peacefully beside the basket. The princess was curled up, hugging a teddy bear. When Relia saw the princess, she was startled, but the fear quickly vanished. Something else caught her attention, and she completely forgot about the food. Relia was suddenly overcome with a frantic urge to take the teddy bear the girl was sleeping with. She didn't even realize how much she wanted the toy, as if she had to have it no matter what. She knew it was wrong, but her hand was already reaching out. A moment later, the teddy bear was in the hands of our minor character of the moment. She just wanted to hold the doll tightly in her arms, to feel a shred of warmth and love, even for a second. Relia stood there holding the doll, completely unsure of what to do next. So she hesitated, took a few steps back, and then the girl turned and bolted. Relia didn't get far before two men shouted at her. After seeing who they were, she knew she was in big trouble. The twins thought the thief should be ashamed for stealing the princess's doll. One of the twins froze when he saw the thief's face. He recognized her as his aunt's daughter, the woman who had tormented his mother. The commotion woke Juliana, who saw Relia holding her doll. The brothers wouldn't let it go. They believed the girl had committed a crime punishable by death. Juliana told her brothers to calm down and not be so arrogant toward the girl. Juliana looked at Relia, introduced herself, and said that the doll was very precious to her. So the princess really wanted the doll back. Relia was ashamed of what she had done. She knew she had messed up this time. She walked up to Juliana and handed her the stuffed bear. The girl sincerely thanked her for returning her favorite toy. The brothers didn't think that was enough, so they weren't going to let Relia off easily. They demanded she come over, kneel, and beg for forgiveness. One of the men told Juliana to hold her ground, saying she was a princess and needed to be tougher on the thief. The girl knew she couldn't just ignore such a blatant act of theft. Hearing the princess agree, the brothers turned back to the thief. One of them said directly that she had to bow her head and forced her to do so. Then he went on to say that she had to apologize like that 100 times. The girl felt even more worthless than before, as if she were nothing. She started to do as they said, tears streaming down her face. With every bow, she begged for Her Highness the princess's forgiveness. Relia hadn't reached 100 apologies before the emperor appeared. The children were thrilled to see their father, who was usually busy to death. He picked up his little daughter and carried her back to the castle, as it was almost time for dinner. The brothers said their father was a cheat because it was supposed to be their day to carry her. Relia stopped bowing and just stared at the emperor, speechless. The man looked back at her, his face expressionless, giving no hint of what he was thinking. Then he turned and walked toward the castle. The girl was left alone in the woods with nothing but her thoughts and this suffocating loneliness. All these characters, and even Relia's actions, were supposed to be mere props in the story. But this new Relia, she was a world away from the version in the book. Meanwhile, the princes returned from the city and went straight to Oscar. The kid tried to hide his frustration, but he wasn't doing a very good job. Relia wasted no time and immediately decided to give the gift to Oscar. He took the rabbit, still oblivious to what had just happened. Ray explained that he wanted to give Oscar a gift, and the crown prince was very surprised. The captain mentioned that the doll could absorb people's melancholy. The princes thought their leader was spouting nonsense again, just like a child. Relia was appalled at what the guys were thinking, so she called them out since they had all bought the same damn doll. The jab hit its mark, and the guys were left speechless. Romeo was happy that they all had matching dolls now. Relia remembered Romeo and Calix whining like children in the shop, saying they needed the exact same dolls. Romeo tried to explain to the captain that they were all peers, so it wasn't nice to call them children. After that, the day proceeded as usual, and everyone went to sleep peacefully. That night, Relia went to bed too, but she just couldn't fall asleep. She placed the rabbit doll beside her and stared hard at it. The girl moved the rabbit doll closer to her. In that moment, she was incredibly happy because now she had her own rabbit, and it wasn't something stolen or found that someone could take away from her. She remembered that everyone had a rabbit doll now. The toys were bringing the princes closer. Now, the girl felt she would never be jealous of Juliana's doll again. Another piece of good news was that the priest had added an extra bed to Ray's room. This would help everyone sleep better, as Romeo would be less restless in his sleep. Romeo thought this was a bit of an overreaction. He had only kicked someone a few times and fallen out of bed. Romeo ended up just saying they should stop talking about him and get to sleep. A strong wind had picked up outside, and it looked like a heavy rain was coming. Griffith turned off the lights, while Oscar was lost in thought. Before long, all the crown princes had settled in for the night. At some point, the ever-restless Romeo rolled to the edge of his bed again. A huge bolt of lightning jolted the blonde boy right off his mattress. The fall was painful and woke the crown prince up completely. A few seconds later, the blonde boy heard a faint sound, like crying. Romeo realized the sound was coming from Oscar, who was completely covered by his blanket. To avoid waking anyone, Romeo quietly made his way to the captain's bed in the dark. The boy gently started calling for Ray, trying not to wake the others or startle the leader. He did, however, quickly wake Relia, though Romeo did give her a scare. Romeo said they had a problem with Oscar again. He explained that Oscar seemed to be having another episode. Romeo said the kid was having trouble breathing and that he was going to get the priest. Relia didn't think they needed the priest and rushed into the boys' room. Griffith and Calix were already awake, standing by Oscar's bed with a lamp. When the girls saw Oscar's condition, she grew uneasy. He was off the bed, covering his ears and trembling like mad. The heroine ran to the kid's side and started calling his name, trying to bring him to his senses. Relia touched his face, telling him she was here. Oscar responded to the girl's voice, but his eyes were still empty. She began to soothe him, repeatedly saying that everything would be okay. It worked. The kid was completely focused on his friend. The heroine praised Oscar, telling him he was doing a great job. The girl waited for the guy to overcome his fear and calm down. It turned out the rain had triggered the episode. Oscar tried to explain it. He was searching for the right words, and you could tell it was hard for him to talk about. Oscar said his mom had died on a rainy day. Relia tried to comfort him, repeating that the rain was just rain. The girls settled the prince into bed and assured him that nothing bad would happen now. Relia didn't expect a miraculous cure, but she was hoping for a little progress. She glanced at the toy by the pillow. The heroine placed the rabbit doll next to Oscar. Relia told him that whenever he felt scared or anxious, he had to remember one thing. He just needed to grab this toy and talk to it as if Ray were right there with him. The boy hugged the toy tighter and began to calm down. Relia breathed a sigh of relief. She had managed to stop Oscar's episode. Afterwards, the heroine remembered they weren't alone in the room. The other crown princes were watching her intently. Calix asked Ray if Oscar was possessed by a demon. Oscar pretended not to understand what they were talking about, while Relia suddenly felt the urge to punch Calix. She walked right up to him and pinched his cheek for having such a stupid idea. Griffith asked the leader why Oscar was acting so strangely if he wasn't possessed by a demon. The girl realized she needed to explain everything clearly to these two princes. She was calm, though, as this wasn't the first time she'd had to explain. She agreed to tell Calix and Griffith what was really going on with Oscar. Relia mentioned that she had already explained everything about Oscar to Romeo once. While Ray explained why Oscar wasn't possessed, the kid was relaxing with the rabbit doll in his arms. Relia explained in detail that what was happening to Oscar was the result of trauma. Then she added that everyone is afraid of something, even if it's just one thing. Griffith asked their leader what he was most afraid of. The girl thought to herself that her biggest fear was hunger, but that answer would be very strange. So she said her biggest fear was a famine sweeping the empire. Calix said that was nonsense, but Griffith clearly appreciated the captain's answer. Oscar's biggest fear was his father, and Romeo was afraid of demons. Griffith claimed he wasn't afraid of anything, but Relia thought he would just never admit his fears. Calix was suspiciously quiet, so Ray asked him why he was so silent. The prince proudly declared that there was nothing in the world he was afraid of, as he hadn't even flinched when facing a pack of wolves. Oscar suddenly chimed in, saying he knew what Calix was afraid of, cuddling the rabbit doll. The kid said that Calix was afraid of girls. Oscar said that the last time he saw a girl try to talk to Calix, Calix freaked out and ran away. This made Calix instantly turn red and start shouting that it never happened. He demanded Oscar take back what he said, and the others had to hold the crown prince back before he lost it. Just as Calix was about to lose control, the captain suddenly diverted everyone's attention. Ray was sitting on the side, laughing his head off. From where he sat, the whole scuffle looked ridiculous. The hearty laughter immediately calmed Calix down, and both Romeo and Griffith breathed a sigh of relief. Calix thought the captain shouldn't be laughing so loud, but the captain couldn't stop. He found it too funny. Romeo was glad things ended this way. After all the talk about fears, though, the friends still didn't know what Griffith and Calix were actually afraid of. Romeo suggested they talk about things they liked instead. Relia loved the idea. Talking about likes was much better than talking about fears. Everyone started to think, and it turned out that even this question wasn't so easy to answer. Each of them tried to identify the happiest thing in their lives. And so, the princes talked all night, discussing their likes and dislikes, laughing and completely ignoring the storm raging outside. That day marked a major strengthening of the bond between the 5 princes. They began to celebrate each other's birthdays and their respective empires' holidays together. The seasons flew by amidst all this commotion, and now the princes could call each other true friends. 2 years had passed since that conversation. A girl asking him to accept a letter pulled Ryo back from his thoughts. Relia accepted the letter with the dignity befitting a prince. He looked at the girl, thanked her, and promised to take good care of the letter. The girl blushed with excitement, as did her friends standing a short distance behind her. The girls watched the prince walk away, thinking what a nice person he seemed to be. Ryo returned to his room and saw a pile of about 20 letters on his desk, now joined by one more from some new admirer. The others noticed that their captain had received another letter. Calix wondered how the leader wasn't tired of all this attention yet. Everyone had just finished their fencing class, and Calix was starving. He had worked so hard in class that his appetite was almost as big as Ray's. Griffith said that Romeo and Oscar were still in the shower, but should be there soon. A few minutes later, the other crown princes finally appeared. In their common room, Romeo was surprised that the captain was back from the library so soon. Relia said that, yes, she had finished everything quickly. Oscar suddenly decided to hand Ray a letter. Relia was terrified, thinking the guy was about to confess, but it turned out the priest had asked him to pass it along. The girl knew instantly who the letter was from, and her good mood vanished in a flash. She silently tore open the envelope and focused on its contents. The first question was, has Relia grown taller? That really hit a sore spot, because in the last 3 years, everyone here had grown taller, and even Oscar was taller than her now. She felt that being the shortest seriously damaged her reputation as captain. Her mood plummeted, and she told everyone to hurry up and get changed for lunch. Everyone was starving after training, so no one argued with that. The girl fully unfolded the letter, confirming it was from Emperor Rythius of the Orlean Empire. She began to read its contents carefully. With every line she read, more fear and despair consumed her. After a while, the whole group was waiting for the captain so they could finally go to lunch. Ray swept his eyes over everyone with a look of displeasure and annoyance, without saying a word. After that, the girl turned and headed for the living quarters. The others didn't understand why the captain was acting this way, so Calix decided to approach him. He caught up to Ray and put a hand on his shoulder, asking where he was going. The girl whipped around and knocked my friend's hand off her shoulder. After that, Ray told them to leave her alone this time. Everyone was shocked, especially Oscar. He asked if there was anything they could do to help Relia. Ray just told Oscar to shut up and not to talk to him. Romeo tried to explain that they were all very worried about the captain. Griffith added that Ray had never been like this before. The girl knew this herself, but she was having a hard time processing the overwhelming emotions. She started to tremble under the pressure, but just snapped that they knew nothing about her. With that, she stormed off, trying to get away as fast as possible to be alone. Everyone was stunned into silence by the captain's sudden change, left standing in place. No one said another word. Back in her room, Relia slammed the door shut and leaned against it. A second later, she finally caught her breath and moved away from the door. She walked over to the sofa and knelt beside it, trying to calm herself down. The girl knew that the situation couldn't possibly get any worse now. Relia no longer knew what to do or how to act. To be honest, there was nothing in the Emperor's letter that she didn't already know or that was particularly special. But just one sentence was enough to make her snap. The letter said that she should not forget her duty and should stay in her place. The warning was actually pointless, as the magic of silence prevented her from revealing the real Ryo. The girl thought about how much she had talked with the princes over the past 2 years, but she never had any chance to tell them the truth about herself. The heroine knew that a year after they parted ways, the princes would receive a letter about Ryo's death. At first, Relia had even hoped that moment would come quickly, so she wouldn't have to see those troublemakers anymore. But as time went on, the bond between her and the princes grew stronger and stronger. The time they spent together became the happiest of her life. She didn't want it to end, and she began to forget that she was just an imposter. The heroine started to wonder how the boys would feel when they received the letter about her death. She could roughly imagine how each of them would react to their captain's death. Ryo's passing would affect every one of them and leave a permanent scar on their hearts. She wished she could lessen their pain, but there was absolutely nothing she could do. That's why Relia came up with the idea of ruining her relationship with the princes before they left the temple. She was still so lost in her thoughts that she didn't even notice the princes had entered her room. She told them in a firm voice that she had asked them to stop barging into her room. Romeo said it was foolish to think they would just pretend everything was fine. She yelled at Romeo to shut up and leave her alone. Then Oscar chimed in uncertainly, saying their captain was acting really strange. Romeo pleaded with Ray to tell them what was wrong, saying they would do their best to help. Calix also wanted to know what was wrong with their leader and why Ray wouldn't explain anything. Griffith thought Ray was deliberately trying to ruin their relationship all of a sudden. Oscar hesitantly added that it was Ray who taught them to share their problems. That was hard to argue with, so Ray just tried to pretend he didn't hear them. Oscar walked up to the leader and gently took his hand, just as the captain had once done to soothe little Oscar. The prince reminded him again that Ryo could always count on his friends. After hearing those words, Relia could no longer hold back the storm of emotions inside her. Oscar was at a loss when he saw the heroine's face, not knowing how to react. But the crown prince still didn't let go of her hand, hoping she could at least feel his support this way. The girl gathered her courage and looked at Oscar, her entire face already streaked with tears. Relia decided that she really needed to explain things to her friend somehow. She collected her thoughts and began to speak, but her trembling voice betrayed her. She couldn't even get out a full sentence before the tears started to flow. Even harder. Despite this, she managed to say that she didn't want them to be sad if she were to die one day. None of the crown princes had expected an answer like that. Romeo had to double-check what the captain was trying to tell them. He thought the captain might be upset because they would be separating soon, or had just had a bad dream. Calix pointed out that even if they separated in the near future, they would all see each other again soon. According to the book, the Mark Bearers were destined to team up and fight a dragon. Calix swore that during that mission, he would do everything in his power to protect the captain. Ryo quietly replied that he might not be able to join their dragon-slaying party. He didn't bother explaining that he was supposed to be dead by then. The girl decided she needed to finish the explanation she had started. Relia shared that someone was after his father's throne, which meant the crown prince was in danger. So the girl concluded by saying that with her weak body and the threats to her life and the empire, the princes had better be prepared for Ryo not to be the dragon slayer. She added that they needed to be extra careful and that all of them had to come back alive. Suddenly, Relia heard a clear and loud no, which left her completely stunned. It was Oscar, who was standing there, also crying, but his voice was filled with conviction as he said he didn't want the captain to die. Oscar added that he hated this, and Relia had never seen him like this before. But just a few seconds later, Oscar's resolve crumbled, and he pleaded through his tears for the captain not to die. The other princes started to try to calm Oscar down. They definitely didn't want to be stuck with two crying princes. But after those words, Relia finally began to feel at ease. She looked at the more mature Oscar and remembered what would happen to him in the future. One day, he would obtain a magic sword and become immortal. She looked at Calix, who was already acting incredibly brave even when he didn't need to. He would go down in history as the mercenary king, wielding a sword that others couldn't even lift. Griffith had unlocked his powers much earlier than the story intended. This prince would become a holy sword user, with power far surpassing the most sacred of Clovis. And Oscar, always rebellious and never satisfied, he too would be remembered. he would earn the title of a spirit-tongue sorcerer, master the dragon's heart, and become the youngest person ever to build a magic tower. And then there was her, Relia, surrounded by all these legends, yet full of lies and good for nothing. Just for being able to be friends with these future legends, she felt a great sense of pride welling up inside her, but amidst this pride, she also felt a sharp pang. The thought of being destined to have these loyal friends, only to lose them, felt terrible. The girl added that one day, each of them would become part of a legend. So on the day she left, they shouldn't feel sad. The next morning, Romeo and the companions came looking for the captain early. Ray took a long time to open the door, so the companions asked if their leader was crying again. These words only made Relia more annoyed. The companions were now always teasing her about being ready to burst into tears at any moment, which made her furious. The girl really didn't know how to face them after yesterday's scene. She was extremely embarrassed, but she still felt it was the right thing to do to tell them about Ray's possible death. But because of those tears, Calix started calling her crybaby Rio. Relia really wanted to kill the guy. After lying in bed for a while, she felt that self-pity wouldn't solve anything. So the girl calculated that she had about 6 months left at the temple. This meant she had to create as many good memories as possible during this time. Romeo pointed out that today was Griffith's birthday, so they couldn't let the captain be alone all day. Relia threw the doll onto the bed and told the princess she was asleep so she couldn't hear them. That night, Griffith received tons of birthday wishes from his companions and a huge cake. Each prince had carefully prepared a letter as a gift. Giving birthday letters was basically a tradition for the temple students. Now Calix was bummed because they could no longer sneak into town to buy birthday presents. Oscar and Relia still couldn't figure out how they had managed it last time, which was all thanks to Romeo. Romeo said, "Hey, that whole thing was the captain's idea. Don't pin it all on me. Besides, hey, today is the last day Ray can look down on Romeo." Because Romeo had just pulled off something big, and Ray would be thanking him for it for a long time. The heroine had no idea what Romeo was so proud of, but Oscar remembered that tomorrow was someone else's birthday, someone super important to their captain. Calix also remembered they had celebrated another birthday last year. They had a party, but they never actually figured out whose birthday it was. Romeo guessed the captain was talking about his girlfriend's birthday. Ray snapped at Romeo, saying it was the stupidest thing he had ever heard. The heroine tried to explain that it was just a very important person in her life. The insecure Oscar immediately jumped to the wrong conclusion, thinking that someone was more important than his friends. "Hey man," she cut him off, "you've got all wrong." She didn't know how to tell them the truth, but she knew they deserved an answer. Relia explained that this person was very close to her, and they had known each other since they were children. She desperately wanted to tell Oscar the whole truth, but because of a magical oath, saying it would literally kill her. She looked at Oscar and told him he shouldn't be upset about it. Relia then added that Oscar was a very important friend of her too. The friends finally started the party. The cake was cut, and the celebration officially began. Romeo handed out slices of cake to everyone, a responsibility he had taken on at some point. Relia, for her part, focused on enjoying the party and the cake as much as she could. For a moment, she wondered if all this fun would disappear the moment she returned home. The girl really didn't want to go back to the Empire, but time was relentlessly ticking by. She figured out on her own that how she spent her remaining time at the temple was crucial, but thinking about the future was also key. She had to avoid an early death. She needed to stay away from that pond and stay close to the castle's exit so she could find a chance to escape. Sadly, real problems like the restoration of the former emperor were far beyond Relia's control. She also worried about her friends getting involved in that dragon-slaying battle, where Calix would be gravely injured. He would slice through the dragon's scales with his sword, but he would be right in the path of the monster's attack. In the end, Calix would manage to hit the dragon. The dragon would retaliate wildly, launching round after round of fatal attacks at him. But Calix would hold his ground and fight to the last, delivering the final blow to the dragon with his sword and ultimately helping to restore peace. Calix would have to pay for that peace with his life. His flesh and bones were melted, and if it weren't for Griffith's divine power, Calix wouldn't have survived at all. Griffith managed to heal most of his friend's wounds, but not all of them. He couldn't restore his eyes. For years, the people of the Ascadian Empire had lived under the Emperor's tyranny, dreaming of a new ruler. They hoped that after defeating the dragon, Calix would ascend the throne. But when they saw him, They began to fear this prince of their empire. Calix's eyes were now completely different. Golden eyes had always been a symbol of Ascadian power, believed to be able to see through all hidden things. It was these golden eyes that the heroine remembered from her time at the temple. After Calix went blind, his eyes emitted an eerie, mysterious glow, and people began to keep their distance from him. They thought Calix was some kind of cursed dragon. The guy didn't seek pity and didn't take the rejection too hard, but he did start to hide his eyes. The heroine, Juliana, didn't find Calix's eyes scary at all and was ready to offer him some comfort. Juliana believed his eyes had saved the world, and she didn't think he was cursed. Those words melted the hero's heart, and he became yet another one of Juliana's many admirers. But no romance ever blossomed between them, and the hero returned to a life of wandering. Just like that, he lost everything, from his hands and sight to love and his own country. Reading the book, the girl couldn't understand how anyone could treat the hero that way. And now, as Relia, she would never forget the way he used to smile like a complete fool. A terrible, unimaginable future lay before this guy, and the heroine really wanted to stop it. But in the original story, there wasn't the slightest chance to change that kid's fate, because he was the only one who could pierce the dragon's scales and deliver the final blow. He would tell his companions that even if he knew what would happen, there was nothing he could do. The girl had tried many times to find a way out, but still saw no hope. To make matters worse, the thought that Relia couldn't even fully control her own body now was even more depressing. It was terrible that her character had no magical abilities whatsoever. At least then she could have been of some help, if not to Calix, then to herself. But the girl couldn't feel a single trace of magic in her body. Those with magic could accumulate and train it within their bodies. People who infused magic into their weapons were called aura masters, while those who used magic to practice their craft were called mages. The girl was angry that she was trapped in this novel without even getting a few spells as a bonus. She was also annoyed that she knew nothing about alchemy. Although alchemy was considered some kind of heretical power and strictly forbidden in this world, there were rumors that the Philosopher's Stone could grant any wish you could dream of. The legendary elixir could heal any injury, eradicate any disease, and even conquer death. The problem was neither the Philosopher's Stone nor the elixir had ever actually been created in this world. But you could sell potions that cured diseases on the black market, and Relia thought she could make some money that way. If she was lucky, maybe she could even restore Calix's eyes. But that was just wishful thinking. After all, she was powerless, and realistically, she would probably starve to death in this tower. The heroine wondered if she should take the opportunity to escape when the rebellion broke out in the castle. Alternatively, she could go and beg Juliana to save her. After all, she was the novel's heroine. If Relia told that girl she was hungry, she would never refuse her. Juliana would probably drag over a whole basket of food and help her escape. But if the heroine ran into the emperor or one of his brothers, it would basically be a death sentence. The girl faced a difficult choice, and a lot depended on it. A few seconds later, Relia had a brilliant idea. She remembered a cabin in the woods near the tower, which was Elizabeth's secret hideout. Her mother used to conduct all sorts of magical research there. The cabin might have a bunch of useful things, as well as emergency rations preserved with magic. In the book, Perseus gave the cabin to Juliana after seeing she had magical abilities and being instantly reminded of his dead wife. The girl decided that if she could get to the cabin before Juliana, she could get some food there. All I have to do is sneak into this sanctuary and steal some food without being discovered. While I'm at it, I also have to take my mother's magical items. Those items would help her escape the Imperial Palace, because if she stayed, she would have no future. Even if it was dangerous and would make her a thief, she had to try. With these chaotic thoughts, she fell asleep, clutching her rabbit doll tightly. She decided that even if she had to do it all alone, she would be fine. She held the rabbit tightly and promised herself that she would find a way to survive, no matter what. The next day, Romeo handed each of the princes a strange-looking feather. He explained that these were magic feathers. This way they could communicate with each other. Then Romeo showed them how his own feather worked. He gave a personal demonstration on the spot. A roll of parchment appeared out of thin air in front of each prince. No one had ever seen magic like this before, not even Griffith or Calix. They unrolled the parchments and saw a message written by Romeo. The blond boy explained that when one of them wrote, the words would appear in front of everyone at the same time. Romeo added that the magic would work as long as the magic crystal was still in the quill. It turned out this was what Romeo was talking about yesterday, when he hinted that we would all be praising him for his genius. Relia was thrilled at the thought that she could message her friends until the day Rio died. After the blonde boy showed off his surprise, he suggested they go eat cake. Calix was not thrilled about them eating cake 2 days in a row. The candles were lit, and everyone wished a happy birthday to an unknown person, the captain's close friend. The companions waited for their leader to blow out the candles, but Ray was in no hurry. After a moment, the captain carefully blew them out. No one noticed that in that moment, Ray's face looked more sad than happy. But what was done, and it was time to cut the cake for everyone. The boys clapped and cheered, congratulating their captain with all their hearts. When Calix saw the leader's face, he was afraid they had done something wrong, because their leader looked like he was about to cry again. Lately, Calix couldn't understand Rio's mood swings, and Oscar also thought something was wrong with Relia again. The girl wiped away her tears and said she was fine. They didn't need to worry. Romeo reached for a handkerchief, thinking the captain really should start carrying her own. They were tears of joy, because the princess had decided to celebrate a birthday for someone they didn't even know. Because today wasn't Ray's birthday, but really is a minor character in the novel. The girl wiped her tears and thanked everyone for the birthday wishes. The boys still didn't understand why their leader had started crying again. Romeo felt bad, but he didn't know how to help the captain with her emotions. Relia thought that she might have to spend her next birthday alone again. The voice of one of the princes pulled the heroine out of her thoughts. They wanted to know more about who they were celebrating for this year. Romeo guessed it was someone Relia could never see again. The blonde boy suggested that maybe they were celebrating Ray's mother's birthday. Hearing this, Calix realized this might explain the tears on the captain's face. Griffith and Oscar remained silent, but a touch of sadness crossed their faces as well. Seeing her companions all gloomy, the girl immediately blurted out that it wasn't her mom's birthday. A moment later, the girl remembered that each of the princes had already lost their mothers. Oscar's biological father had murdered his mother a few years ago. Calix had lost both his parents almost as soon as he was born. Griffith knew nothing about his birth mother, and his stepmother hated him. Romeo's mother had killed herself in front of him. Come to think of it, really his mother also had a rather tragic fate. The girl decided that no negative or gloomy emotions would ruin this day. So she sat comfortably on the sofa, picked up a fork, and started digging into the uncut cake. A second later, she dug out a huge piece and began to devour it. The companions started to complain, and Oscar began to worry about the captain again. With her mouth full, Ray mumbled that if they didn't start eating the cake soon, she was going to eat the whole thing. The companions knew the captain was capable of it, so they pounced on the cake too. That evening, the sunset was incredibly beautiful without a breath of wind. Calix commented caustically that the captain looked like she was about to cry again. Romeo helplessly reached for a tissue, only to find that Oscar was also carrying one for the captain. Relia knocked Calix and Romeo on the head, telling them to stop messing with her about crying all the time. Afterwards, Calix asked if the captain was really not crying. The kid pointed out that the leader had been bawling at every opportunity recently. Relia looked annoyed and retorted that she wasn't crying now and didn't plan to. To be honest, Relia decided she would never cry again. Then she added that they didn't have much time left together, so wasting it on tears was a complete waste. The girl wanted to cram in all sorts of cool things while she could still be with the princes. She wanted to have as much fun as possible and laugh until she couldn't laugh anymore. Ray asked her companions to remember her happy smile, not her tear-stained face. She also hoped her companions would smile as much as possible so she could remember them happy. As it turned out, that time in the temple was the happiest time of the heroine's life. But the day of parting finally came, and they all had to separate and return to their respective empires. An attendant entered the prince's room and announced that his carriage had arrived. Hearing this, Relia had to force herself to pull it together. The worst part of her life was about to begin. She put on a calm expression and replied that she would be ready soon. When she came out, she saw that each prince's carriage was already waiting. She wanted to say a cheerful goodbye, but the tears welled up again. Calix pointed out that they would see each other again in a few years and told her to stop crying. A sobbing Oscar begged her to be sure to write all the time. Griffith looked gloomy and whispered that he would miss the captain. Romeo said, "Can you stop crying? This atmosphere is killing me." His words did not stop Ray and Oscar from bawling their eyes out. Romeo could only endure it and wait for the two of them to calm down. But he couldn't just stand there, so he unexpectedly walked over and hugged Griffith. Then he did the same to a completely shocked Calix. Next was a hug for the sobbing Oscar. He wished each of them well and told them to contact him if anything happened. Romeo's uncharacteristic behavior actually made Relia stop crying. She flashed back to when she first met all the princes, when Romeo had said he hated every one of his so-called friends. Looking back at those words now, they just seemed ridiculous. The girl couldn't help but laugh out loud. The princes were baffled by Ray's sudden mood swing from crying to laughing. They asked if Ray was okay, and Relia immediately snapped and started punching Calix. Calix had no idea why the captain was suddenly hitting him specifically, and the captain didn't understand it herself. The girl glared at Calix and said he was a heartless idiot. Hearing this, Calix suddenly had the urge to punch his leader. Ray went on to say that he was sometimes angry with Calix, but he never truly hated him. Relia pointed out that because he was so straightforward, he was the easiest person to talk to. Then the heroine added that he absolutely had to be careful when he got home, especially of his uncle. To Griffith, the girl admitted that at first, she thought he was keeping his distance from them. She was glad that he always had their backs, and that it was because of him that they had all become so close. She told him to be careful of anyone trying to take advantage of his power. After returning home, Griffith comforted Ray, telling him not to worry. Afterwards, the girl went to say goodbye to Oscar. She told the guy that the prince had really tried hard to change himself over the past 3 years. Relia pointed out that he was an amazing person for not giving up and conquering his fears. A moment later, she added that no matter how far apart they were, as long as they had each other's dolls, they would always have each other. Oscar started crying again, promising he would be careful and stay healthy. It was the best answer she could have heard from a close friend. Romeo was the last one, but the girl didn't know what to say to him or how to say it. So she just pointed at him and told him he needed to cool it and be a bit more likable. Romeo was stunned by this farewell from his best friend. A moment later, the kid gave the captain a light punch on the head. Relia added that she was just stating the facts, then took a good look at the blonde boy. Romeo just stood there sullenly, his eyes starting to get wet. He hugged the leader and promised to try to be what she wanted. The girl hugged Romeo back, thanking him for saving her life from the pond that day. The heroine didn't say it out loud, but she thought Romeo was a truly kind and brave guy. After that, the priestesses began to move the boys' things into the carriages. And just like that, the moment for them to go their separate ways had arrived. Relia watched each prince leave and then finally climbed into her carriage. She was incredibly depressed because only she knew what awaited them. To make matters worse, this was the last time in her life she would ever see them. The thought of never being able to see them as Prince Rio again made her heart ache. But she would still cherish these 3 years forever, the best time of her 2 lives. Thanks to those 4, Relia would never feel alone again. In her heart, each of them had become her family, and nothing could ever change that. Even now, they had all grown into handsome, young men worthy of the title of hero. She would always remember them as they were now. Young, full of life, and looking toward the future with hope. The girl turned around and thanked them for the full 3 years at the temple. The carriage slowly pulled out of the temple courtyard. Each of the princes was lost in thought about the future. Calix was glad that Rio supported his approach, even though everyone else was against it. He had announced he wanted to give up his heir status and become a mercenary because his uncle would be a lot of trouble. Griffith thought his friend's plan was completely insane. Romeo was also clueless, not understanding why the guy would want to leave the royal family. Hearing him confess his feelings, Rio immediately approached Calix. He said it was a brilliant idea and that he had complete faith his friend would achieve great success. Relia had interjected then, saying that Calix was destined to become one of the greatest mercenaries of all time. Suddenly, Calix remembered a dream he had the night before they left. The dream had wolves in it, and it showed what happened during his first year at the temple. He lost an arm in the dream, but the strangest thing was that he couldn't find Ray anywhere. Calix felt like the dream was showing how things would have turned out if the captain hadn't intervened. The dream upset him, and he tried to figure out what it meant. After a while, a wave of sadness washed over him at the thought of how his aunt, uncle, and their children would treat him when he got home. His family would most likely try to kick him out. The guy looked at the mark and realized he was no longer afraid of that happening. And the reason he wasn't afraid was that Rio believed in him and trusted him completely. He repeated the captain's words about becoming the best mercenary, and his mood instantly lifted. Meanwhile, the person escorting Rilia reported to the Emperor that the kid had returned to the tower where she was originally. The Emperor decided to keep the girl by his side. She might. He was still of use to him, so he ordered soldiers to set up guard nearby and had her watched. Rilia stared at the tower where she had spent almost her entire life, knowing she would be trapped here until the rebellion was over, and maybe even after. But unlike the heroine in the book, Rilia had no intention of sitting back and waiting for death. She planned to escape this castle alive. Although it was still very early, Rilia decided to write a letter to the guys. She wrote about the weather, said she had already eaten breakfast, and that it was much more comfortable at home. The girl mentioned that home-cooked meals were much tastier and more varied, and best of all, she no longer had to listen to their annoying nagging. The heroine tied up her hair. The unheated tower was bone-chillingly cold, and the clothes she wore offered no protection against the cold and the draft. Rilia glanced at her suitcase, thankful they hadn't taken that as well. This way, she at least had some food and winter clothes she had brought from the temple. They also hadn't taken one of her most prized possessions, her toy rabbit. She hugged it every day, thinking of her friends back home. Besides, the toy rabbit had become the only one she could talk to in this godforsaken place. There was a fireplace in the tower, so she started wandering around outside to gather some decent branches. It turned out that the skills she had learned for lighting the ovens at the temple were now coming in very handy. Of course, at the temple, they had plenty of matches and candles, so she never really had to start a fire on her own. As the days went by, she missed civilization and people more and more. The girl, who had been staring at the sparks, finally saw the branches catch fire. Suddenly, thick, heavy gray smoke billowed from the fireplace, making her choke. It seemed she had accidentally mixed wet branches with dry ones. Now her eyes were stinging from the smoke, but it was better than freezing to death. The girl decided she needed to gather as much firewood as possible before the snow got too heavy. The temperature inside the tower was much colder than she had initially thought, so she had to prepare for the severe cold. At least there was running water in the tower, which was a plus. She guessed that magic heated the water, but she didn't know how that would help her. Rilia had originally planned to visit Elizabeth's secret cabin as soon as she returned, but she couldn't because the Emperor had sent guards to watch her. To be safe and not anger the Emperor, she decided to wait patiently for the right moment. By spring, the surveillance on her would be lifted, and the real Rio would soon be poisoned by Radius's faction. Shortly after that, the rebel army would storm the palace with the former Emperor. By then, the palace would be in chaos, inside and out, with blood flowing like rivers. It was better for her to stay in the tower until the new emperor was enthroned. Emperor Perseus cared far less about her than his brother did, so she would have more room to move. The bad thing was, after Rio's death, the heroine would no longer be able to write to her friends. She saw that her letter hadn't been answered yet, which meant everyone was still asleep. She waited a few more minutes and decided to start her daily routine. Judging by how heavily the snow was falling, she desperately needed to start stocking up on firewood. The girl walked out of the tower and followed her usual path to gather wood. The weather outside was getting colder by the day. At that moment, the heroine felt lonely again. Lost in thought, she wasn't paying attention to where she was going and immediately tripped. It wasn't a bad fall, but hitting the cold, hard ground always hurt. She saw that her hand was scraped and the wound began to sting. The girl decided she needed to make a thorough plan for the future. With the change of emperors, it was crucial to find that cabin with food and magic items as soon as possible. She hoped Elizabeth wouldn't be angry if her daughter took her supplies. It was also important that she avoid Juliana and her brothers as much as possible. This girl had no desire to become a character in a book, endlessly apologizing. After making all these preparations, all she had to do was escape the tower at the right moment. In the novel, Rilia died after falling into a pond. But if that didn't happen, she would have been married off to some nobody. The girl had no intention of being caught in a political marriage, so she had to escape before that. It started snowing again, and this time it looked like it would last for a long time. The girl knew she needed to speed up her winter preparations. Every day, Rilia went outside to collect branches. Afterward, she would light the fireplace to dry her snow-soaked clothes. Even with the fireplace, the tower was still bone-chillingly cold. Watching the heavy snow swirl outside, the girl was glad she had already gathered so much firewood. She heard a sound and glanced at her desk. The magic letter paper was glowing, which meant one of the guys had finally written back. She rushed over to read the reply, feeling like she had waited a century. The letter said that Ray was a really great guy. It was from Oscar, who was happy that the captain was doing well. The kid wrote that he was doing well himself and was no longer having nightmares. Oscar thought it was the toy Ray gave him that chased away the nightmares. The next sentence stunned her and anyone else who might read their messages. Oscar wrote that he was afraid someone would find the toy. If that happened, the kid would be super embarrassed, so he hid it under his pillow. Kalex didn't join the chat, but he was happy to read his friend's letters. Griffith chimed in, reminding everyone that he was the one with the money that day. Romeo interjected that everyone seemed to be doing well, but he was the only one who was super annoyed. Romeo complained that he was bored to death alone in the castle, and that things were much more interesting. Back at the temple, Romeo ended the chat by asking the other princes what they thought about taming that savage dragon. After reading the messages, Rilia felt that the guys were exactly the same as before. The thought almost made her cry again. She gripped the letter paper tighter, trying to calm herself down. The girl decided she would definitely write a new letter tomorrow. After that, she wrapped herself tightly in a blanket and fell asleep. None of the princes knew that their captain had cried herself to sleep again last night. Time ticked by, the snow piled up, and the firewood was running out. The guys were chatting up a storm on the message board, writing a huge stack of letters back and forth. The food was also running out, which made our girl very panicked. One day, spring finally triumphed over the cold winter, and the snow began to melt little by little. This was great news, because on several occasions, the blizzard had trapped her completely indoors. That day, she was back to square one, not knowing what to do next. Her mind was filled with all sorts of thoughts, and she even considered just hibernating. For a while she was out looking for firewood, she had a sudden flash of insight and realized something important. She looked around to make sure no one was watching her. It was then that the girl felt she had to take advantage of the situation. Meanwhile, in the imperial palace, someone was calling for a maid. It was another maid who looked like she needed help. As one of the girls walked by, she bumped into a man in front of the other maid. Realizing she had interrupted the man's conversation with the maid, she apologized and quickly slipped away. Just then, the man patted the maid's shoulder and told her he was counting on her. Afterward, the maids went their separate ways to do their work. The young girl thought to herself that the man must be the other maid's secret boyfriend. But that maid didn't want to talk about him, and now she was shouldering a major task. It had been months since our girl returned to the tower, and the snow around it had almost all melted. No longer having to struggle to find kindling meant it was easier to find berries left over from last year. Rilia started venturing farther than usual, but still couldn't find Elizabeth's cabin. When the blizzard hit, they had stopped tracking the girl and forgotten about her. Her servants had been killed years ago anyway. So this was the first winter Rilia had spent completely alone, and the arrival of spring didn't make her very happy, because it meant Rio's death was approaching, and her life as a pen pal was about to end. The letters from the boys were the only thing that could make her happy. She was always waiting for her friends' replies, and now she realized it was like being addicted to social media. Even from miles away, the guys gave her strength. She began to wonder how much time Prince Rio had left before he died. Suddenly, she heard excited voices nearby. The knights were saying that the woman His Majesty trusted had done something terrible. Rilia overheard that the emperor had thrown her in prison and that the prince's food had been poisoned. This day had come much earlier than she had expected. Rilia was stunned, as if struck by lightning. She shook her head, crouched down, and started thinking fast. She replayed the words about the prince and the poison in her mind, hoping it wasn't what she thought. But everything added up, which meant Crown Prince Rio was already dead. The girl sprinted towards the tower as fast as she could. She needed to hide all the letters, hide them in a safe place. Looking at the letter paper, she wondered if there was a way to tell them the truth. She froze at her desk, hesitating whether to write to her friends. She knew she was the one sending the messages and hoped the princes would figure out on their own. But the spell prevented her. Even through letters, the heroine couldn't reveal her true identity. If she wrote that Rilia was actually Rio, she would break the rules of the spell. So any hint would lead to her immediate death, which meant she had to keep her mouth shut. Helpless, she looked out the window and saw someone who absolutely shouldn't have appeared so soon. But it was him, and he was coming fast. He was at the head of an army, shouting orders as they reached the castle. The soldiers followed their commander, their goal to overthrow the current emperor. It was the deposed Ruddius Perseus, returned to reclaim his throne. The girl overheard the army telling the locals not to panic, saying they were here to restore the throne for the rightful Emperor Perseus. This meant the soldiers could reach the girl's tower at any moment. Due to the emperor's magical restrictions, she couldn't tell the soldiers the truth. The girl decided she could at least leave a clue. She hoped Romeo or Griffith would understand what she was trying to tell them. On a blank sheet of paper, the girl wrote her name, Relia or Aria. After that, she knew it was time to say goodbye. She removed the magic stone so that no more letters would appear. The girl put all the letters and the magic pen into a box. She hid them under the floor near the wardrobe. Then, the girl climbed into the wardrobe and began to wait for the invasion to end. She tried to calm herself down and think like an adult, but the truth was she was still trapped in the body of a 10-year-old child. Relia was terrified of what was happening outside and deeply frustrated by her own powerlessness. The protagonist hid rigidly in the wardrobe, scared stiff, until the sounds of battle finally subsided. 2 days later, the battle was finally over. Suddenly, one of the emperor's soldiers yanked open the wardrobe door. Meanwhile, the palace servants were already spreading the news like wildfire. The usurper Ruddios Aurelia had been defeated by Emperor Perseus. The man asked the girl's name and if she was truly Princess Iris's daughter, adding that the emperor wanted to see her. Iris Aurelia was the sister of Rithyias and Perseus, and the only princess of the empire. Before Perseus married Elizabeth, she was the highest-ranking woman in the empire. The loss of status made Iris despise Elizabeth and begin to torment her. Her anger erupted when the queen gave birth to twin boys for the emperor. But later, Iris met a man she truly fell in love with. He was just a knight, and he died young, but Iris became pregnant before his death. On the very day of Iris's due date, Elizabeth also went into premature labor. Perseus was away on a mission at the time, and the emperor passed away, which played right into his brother's hands. Realizing that Rithyias had orchestrated the emperor's death and her husband's absence, Elizabeth dismissed all her servants and gave birth to the child alone. She had a daughter, whose life she had to protect at all costs. After giving birth, Elizabeth immediately went to her husband's sister's room. She knew Rithyias would never let Perseus's child live. Elizabeth couldn't trust anyone, but she knew Iris was also giving birth today and was about to become a mother. She hoped to entrust her child to Iris, but when she walked in, she realized a tragedy had already occurred. Iris was sitting on the bed, her face etched with despair. The emperor's sister's newborn child was dead. Iris thought Elizabeth had come to gloat over her misfortune. Elizabeth felt sorry for the girl who had lost both her husband and child, but she couldn't just leave. Elizabeth swallowed her pride, knelt down, and began to beg the girl for help. She showed her own child to the princess, asking her to take the baby as her own. Elizabeth added that Rithyias would soon kill her and the child, so she pleaded with the princess to take the girl so she could live. These words only earned a bitter smile from Iris. She had no intention of helping the woman who had ruined her life. The princess broke down, sobbing that Elizabeth didn't understand what was happening at all. Iris suddenly exploded, shouting that she didn't care about her or her damn child. A maid tried to calm her down, but she had already started screaming that the child had better die on the spot. Just then, the screaming woke the baby, and the little girl looked at the shouting woman and made a strange baby sound. This immediately calmed Iris down, and she began to wail again. The girl was torn between wanting to kill the child and wanting to pick her up. Now, the baby was wide awake and started crying at the top of her lungs. In a hoarse voice, Iris told Elizabeth to just leave the child. Elizabeth thanked the princess quietly and sincerely. The maid handed Iris's dead boy to Elizabeth, begging her to take good care of him. Elizabeth promised to do everything she could for the child. After that, Elizabeth stood up and slowly walked out of Iris's room. She held the baby tightly, but he was already cold. Elizabeth apologized to the boy for separating him from his mother. Meanwhile, in her own room, the princess finally calmed down, holding her baby and feeling his warmth. An image of her dead lover flashed before the girl's eyes. She noticed the baby girl's eyes were exactly like her man's. Iris immediately fell in love with the child, as if she were her own. The lady-in-waiting was terribly worried about her mistress and just wanted to be of some help. She asked what else she could do for Iris, but saw no reaction from the girl. After a while, it was clear that the princess had fallen into a deep sleep. From then on, things went downhill fast. Perseus and the twins were killed on an expedition. Elizabeth was poisoned, and Rithia ascended the throne. Iris's condition worsened day by day. Losing her own child had truly broken her. Shortly before her death, Iris confessed everything to the maid who knew the truth about the baby swap. The maid followed Iris's orders, took care of the child, and never revealed the truth to anyone. Then one day, years later, the maid suddenly disappeared. Along with the maid, Princess Iris's jewels also vanished. There were rumors that the maid's parents had been kidnapped and declared heretics, and that the princess's jewels were meant to save them. In the end, no one knew the truth about Relia. And now, a servant brought her before the emperor as his sister's daughter. The emperor was alone in his study, bent over his desk filling out some documents. Upon seeing the girl, he asked if she was truly Iris's daughter. The emperor noticed Relia's eyes, which were identical to his dead wife's. Perseus was taken aback by this, but he pretended not to see the resemblance. The emperor didn't know Relia was his daughter, and according to the story, he was supposed to be nursing a broken heart. It was the trauma from the death of his wife and their stillborn child. Even killing his own brother brought him no peace, only adding to the pain. According to the plot, all his suffering was meant to help the protagonist. Perseus's entire tragedy existed so that Juliana could heal him. The emperor and Relia stared at each other in silence. After a few minutes, Relia thought that the only reason for her existence in this story was to highlight how much love the emperor's family, Juliana, received. The protagonist was destined to be the one who could bring peace to almost everyone in the novel. Meanwhile, Relia's character would only bring more pain to Perseus. She wanted to tell the truth, but it wouldn't change the book's plot and would only get her killed instantly. The emperor scrutinized her for another long moment. He felt an irresistible wave of sadness wash over him, and he ordered a servant to get her out of his sight as soon as possible. The servant roughly grabbed her shoulder without warning. She glared at the man and told him she could walk on her own. In that instant, fear gripped her as she had another realization. Everyone in this castle was now her enemy. The soldiers and servants all thought she was unworthy of being here. No one said it to her face, but she could see it in their eyes. She felt that loneliness again, and she was just so tired. Alone, the emperor finally let his emotions out. Perseus would one day find out the truth about Relia, but it would be too late. The maid who knew the truth of the girl's birth would return to the palace, but by then Relia would be dead. Even if she could somehow tell the truth, it would be useless. They would just think she was crazy. It was foolish to think the emperor would believe her just because they were related by blood. The heroine had known that long ago when she was trapped in a hospital bed. Just as she was recovering from the servant's attitude, she was confronted by something far more dangerous. A pair of twin brothers were walking towards her, who had also returned to the palace with the emperor. They approached and confronted her, asking if she was really Relia Aurelia. The two guys knew that Iris Aurelia had constantly tormented their mother. From the moment they saw her, they hated the protagonist because of who her mother was. The girl looked at the twins, Cedric and Damien, in terror and could feel the hatred radiating from them. She decided to remain silent, not wanting to provoke more hatred from her half-brothers. Cedric spat that she was as shameless as her mother. The other brother added that their younger brother and mother had died because of her mother's actions. They couldn't believe that after everything Iris had done, her daughter had the nerve to be alive. They started yelling at the girl, calling her a murderer's daughter. The girl didn't respond, which only angered the princes more. Just then, Juliana interrupted them, seeming surprised that her brothers were doing things behind her back. It was then that the protagonist saw the novel's heroine in the flesh for the first time. She was truly beautiful, effortlessly capturing everyone's attention. Even Relia thought the girl looked like a real angel. The brothers didn't want to settle things in front of their little sister. They turned to Juliana, saying they were waiting for her so they could go play together. Their faces changed in an instant, and you couldn't tell they had been dangerous brothers just a second ago. But they still felt really staring at them, and they didn't like it one bit. Before leaving, one of the brothers bluntly said that the girl was disgusting. After that, the children left, chatting about what they would do for the day. After all that, Relia finally returned to the tower. She picked up her rabbit, wondering how her friends would have reacted if they had seen her confrontation with those two. They probably would have been furious and jumped in to protect her. They would have surely said something like, "No one talks to our captain like that." Suddenly, the girl needed to message them, to hear their voices more than ever. She felt like she couldn't stand being here any longer. The protagonist decided she really needed to get a grip and slapped herself across the face. She tried her best to endure it, but the pain still made tears stream down her face. But at least it helped her pull herself together. She told herself that no one could save her, and she wasn't going to remain a helpless child like the Relia in the story. The girl was running out of food, and it was impossible for anyone in the palace to give her any. But there was a silver lining. No one would be watching her so closely now. This meant it was the perfect time to go look for Elizabeth's cottage. One day, luck was on her side, and she actually found the place. The door was unlocked, and Relia carefully pushed it open. The cottage was spotless, and it felt as if someone had been taking care of it. Everything inside was perfectly preserved. She began to imagine herself in the place her mother used to frequent. If Elizabeth were still alive, her life would surely be completely different. The book said that Elizabeth was a beautiful and kind person. She would have sacrificed her own life to protect her daughter from all enemies. In any case, I need to find supplies and magical items quickly, then leave this cottage. It turned out the food was easy to find. It was under the floorboards, neatly stacked in a large chest. To prevent the food from spoiling, Elizabeth had invented her own preservation magic. The jars looked empty, but the first one was labeled bread, so I guess the food would reappear when I opened it. In the book, it was supposed to be Juliana who found these supplies, but she didn't care about the plot at all. She just wanted to survive. The girl thought about the artifacts, but they were hidden much better. Relia knew that magical affinity was usually hereditary, so she was counting on the power of the artifacts. The girl decided not to take any more risks and not to linger in the cottage for too long. She resolved to come back another day to search for the artifacts. On her way back, she overheard someone talking and stopped dead in her tracks. A handmaiden was trying to comfort a crying Juliana, suggesting she take a walk to buy a new dress. The protagonist knew the plot of the book very well, and this conversation was happening too early for her. Meanwhile, the handmaiden suggested Juliana go see her brothers, who had just finished their fencing practice. The handmaiden felt the emperor was too harsh on the girl for not letting her touch him. Juliana immediately replied that her father was fine, just not used to her yet. Now, the protagonist was completely sure she understood what was happening. There was a part in the book where the emperor pushed Juliana away. The poor child was completely terrified and very sad after that. To make up for it, Perseus bought her a doll. It was also after that incident that people started talking about Relia's future, so she had to escape the palace as soon as possible. Around the same time, the twins had been calling Carius for about 2 minutes. The man was so lost in his own thoughts that he had forgotten where he was. The boys were a little frustrated because their uncle hadn't watched them show off their swordsmanship at all. Their uncle reassured them, saying they were both very talented and that no one around was better than them. Then he immediately added that they couldn't slack off and needed to continue training. That way, they could become swordsmen who would go down in history. The brothers wanted their uncle to give them a fencing lesson tomorrow, but Carius already had plans. Carius was planning to stop by the imperial palace. The handmaidens were surprised to see a man from the ducal family of Superio. Carius was the younger brother of the late Princess Elizabeth. Feeling the curious gazes, the young man bowed. Afterward, he turned and walked silently out of the palace. It was said that this younger brother of his sister had been so traumatized by her death that he couldn't speak for a long time. It took the young man a long time to recover and be able to come to the palace. Perhaps he had returned to visit the twin princes. However, Carius was thinking that if Perseus had another son, the prince's right to succession would be threatened. At this rate, the Superio family might become his enemy. Unconsciously, the man found himself in front of Elizabeth's secret cottage. He remembered his sister used to bury herself in magical research here. The pain of losing his sister washed over him again. Carius missed her terribly. Looking closely, the young man noticed the cottage door wasn't fully closed. He decided to see who was inside and what they were doing. He threw the door open and saw the reason it was unlocked. He never expected to see anyone here, especially not a child. The girl was sitting at the table, looking as if she were completely frozen. A sharp voice demanded, "Who are you?" The girl turned around, her eyes filled with fear. She was completely at a loss. The man was also taken aback, stunned for a few seconds. She had never thought someone would show up at the cottage today. She was trembling like a leaf. Panicked, she couldn't say a word. The man saw that she was scared, though he didn't know why. Carius thought she was a handmaiden from the palace who had come to clean the cottage. Seeing that she didn't answer, the prince felt she must be hiding something. Just then, Carius asked for her name. This question was as difficult to answer as the last one. The man waited for an answer, but got none. The girl was completely zoned out, but the fear in her eyes remained. It was only then that the man truly noticed the girl's eyes. They were exactly like his deceased sister's. The man tried to calm himself, thinking the comparison was utter nonsense. He noticed the girl's silver hair, the mark of the Aurelia family. Carius asked the girl if he was to understand that she was Princess Iris's daughter. The man decided that the daughter of the woman who had tormented his sister had no right to be here. He called the girl a rat and demanded she get out of the cottage at once. The man's shouting plunged Relia into a new wave of fear. She stood up with the last of her strength, trembling violently. The girl rushed out of the cottage, too scared to even glance at her mother's brother. She ran for her life, wanting only to get away from the hatred in the man's eyes. Left alone, Carius knew he shouldn't have yelled at the child, but he still thought he had done the right thing. Compared to the endless suffering his sister had endured, a few harsh words were nothing. But deep down, the man still felt bad for what he had done, especially because of the girl's appearance. Iris's daughter was thin, exhausted, and haggard, without a trace of royal dignity. Carius was surprised by this. After all, she was still the daughter of Princess. He began to wonder to what depths a member of a former ruling family could fall. Now, the prince was annoyed with himself for starting to worry about an irrelevant child. The important thing was that his nephews didn't end up the same way. He would do whatever it took to ensure the brothers were the emperor's direct heirs. He couldn't care less about the girl. The girl returned to the tower and shut the door behind her. She burrowed under the covers, trying to calm herself down. Even while hugging the rabbit, Relia couldn't stop trembling. The protagonist knew she was in no immediate danger, but she still couldn't relax. She looked at the toy rabbit, thinking that at least no one could take it away from her. She had bought the Oscar doll to cure his seizures, but it turned out she was the one who relied on the rabbit the most. The girl finally crawled out from under the blanket and decided to think carefully about everything that had happened today. She remembered that during their conversation, the man had called Elizabeth his sister. The protagonist recalled that Elizabeth had several close relatives. Elizabeth was from the Superio family, a respected noble house responsible for defending the empire's northwestern border. It seemed the man had come to the capital to visit his nephews. Relia wondered, if he knew the whole truth, would this man help her? Thinking about it, he was technically her uncle, so he could take her from the tower in the name of being Elizabeth's daughter. But the man probably wouldn't believe a word she said. After all, even her own father hadn't recognized her as his daughter. When she heard footsteps, fear washed over her again. About a minute later, the door to her room was kicked open. The visitor wasn't Elizabeth's brother, but the man she feared most. The man didn't hesitate to ask her directly how she knew about Elizabeth's cottage. The emperor was furious. He was convinced that Iris had revealed the secret of this place to the girl. Perseus wanted an answer, and he wanted it now.